Social battery runs dry. You're at a dinner party and someone just asked you about your weekend for the third time. Your friend is mid-story about a colleague you've never met. The background noise is exactly the volume that makes your skull ache. All you can think about is the drive home. That's not rudeness. That's your nervous system calling mercy. Here's what actually happens as you age. The effort required to be around people doesn't shrink. Your capacity to absorb it does. A younger you might have lasted until midnight, laughing through the haze of small talk. Now you're running on fumes by 9. The cost of showing up has gotten higher. The reward somehow smaller. It's not that people have changed or that you suddenly hate connection. It's that the tax on your attention and emotional presence has become too steep to ignore. The real trap is that nobody talks about this openly, so you start declining invitations, and people assume you're angry or snobby or have chosen solitude. What's actually happening is much simpler. You've learned to recognize the difference between time spent and time well spent. You've run the math on what small talk costs you, the mental switching, the masking, the recovery time afterward, and it stops adding up. The kind of withdrawal that feels like relief isn't always the start of loneliness. Sometimes it's just wisdom. The move isn't to force yourself back into the circuit. It's to find the few people whose presence doesn't deplete you and stop treating that selectivity as a character flaw. Peace beats popularity. You remember that friend who always needed something, a ride, a vent session, validation that they were right about their ex. You'd say yes, you'd show up, and each time the bill got quieter to pay, but heavier to carry. Then one day you stopped answering, and the relief you felt was so clear it surprised you. Here's what actually happens. Your nervous system gets tired, not in a dramatic way, in the slow, invisible way that makes you realize you've spent years running a service line for people who wouldn't move for you. And the brutal part isn't that they're bad people, it's that you can see the pattern now. You've wasted that energy. You're not going to waste more. The math gets simple as you age. Every hour with someone who drains you is an hour you don't have. Every obligation you keep out of guilt is a boundary you're choosing not to build. And at some point, the cost of the relationship, in headspace, in emotional labor, in the small deaths of saying yes when you mean no, stops feeling worth what you actually get back. This isn't cruelty. It's accounting. It's recognizing that popularity was ever the wrong metric anyway. A crowded life isn't the same as a full one. So you cut people off not because you've become hard, but because you've finally figured out what you deserve. People who actually want to be there. Spaces that feel like rest instead of work, and the permission to say no without defending yourself. That's the trade. Fewer people, so much more peace. Energy accounting instinct. You have a finite number of hours left. Nobody knows the real number, but somewhere in your nervous system, your body keeps score anyway. That quiet knowledge does something strange. It makes you start the brutal math on who deserves access to you. When you are young, energy feels infinite. You can text back at midnight, show up to things you half want to attend, manage complicated friendships that demand constant translation. Your tank looks bottomless, so generosity costs nothing. But somewhere in your 40s or 50s, the math shifts. A 3-hour dinner with someone who leaves you drained no longer feels neutral. It feels like choosing to lose 3 hours you will not get back. This is not cruelty. It is thermodynamics. Your body starts keeping score because it has to. The people who truly feed you, who laugh with you, who ask nothing of you, who leave you lighter than before, they stay close. Everyone else starts to feel like overhead. The automatic part sneaks past your awareness. You might not consciously decide to drift from an old friend. You just stop reaching out. Your body is doing the accounting, cutting ties that drain without refilling. It is not personal, it is ecological, a wise triage of your own existence. But sometimes you cut off people you actually love because they are in a hard season and therefore expensive to be around right now. That is the moment to pause. Notice when your accounting is survival and when it is fear wearing efficiency's clothes. Time feels scarce now. You know that feeling when you realize you're not going to finish your coffee before work? Imagine that feeling, but about your entire life. Somewhere in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, the math shifts. You move from thinking, I have time, to knowing with real weight that you don't. Every hour spent listening to someone's story is an hour you won't get back, and that changes which conversations feel worth having. The people who survive this filter are usually those who give you energy, who make the minutes feel full rather than drained. Everyone else starts to feel like a slow leak, not because you're cruel, but because scarcity makes you ruthless about value. That coworker who complains for 40 minutes, a friend who only calls when they need something, the relative who never asks how you are, they get cut off not out of malice, but out of survival. You're protecting what little time you have. This shift can look like wisdom, and sometimes it is. You do get better at knowing yourself, but it can also harden you. You stop answering texts from people just trying to stay connected. You decline invitations because the effort math doesn't work in your favor. The people on the outside never quite understand. They still have the luxury of treating time like it grows back. The question that sticks around after the cutting is whether you kept the right people. Not the ones who served you best, but the ones you actually loved. There's a difference, and usually you don't feel it until much later. Betrayal residue builds up. Think about the person who said they'd be there, then wasn't, or the friend who told your secret, or the family member who took a side that wasn't yours. In the moment, you move on. You tell yourself it's fine, but your nervous system doesn't forget. Each betrayal, even small ones, leaves a tiny scar. The next time someone cancels plans, some part of you goes on alert. Is this it again? When a colleague seems distant, your mind fast forwards to the abandonment story. You aren't being irrational. You're carrying evidence, real evidence, and that evidence gets filed away, not in one neat compartment, but scattered through your whole sense of how people work. The trouble is that residue doesn't stay isolated. It bleeds outward. You start screening everyone through the same filter. A new person has to prove they won't hurt you before you let them close. Except nobody gets to prove anything because you've already half decided they will. Isolation starts to feel like the only smart move. And here's what gets tricky. Cutting people off works. It stops the bleeding. For a while, you feel safer, but safety that comes from pushing everyone away isn't safety. It's just a different kind of wound. The betrayals stay inside you, calcifying into a belief that trust itself is the problem. The way through isn't to forgive and forget. It's smaller. Notice when you're filtering new people through old pain. That filter is trying to protect you, but it's also blocking the kinds of people who wouldn't betray you in the first place. Novelty craving fades. Think back to the last time you made a new friend. There was probably a moment, 3 drinks in or halfway through a long car ride, where you felt that electric snap of discovering something unexpected about them. A story that landed wrong. A belief that shifted the whole conversation, the raw fact of someone new in your orbit. That feeling is what powered friendship in your 20s. But here's the thing your brain does as you age. It gets efficient. Efficient is wonderful for spreadsheets and schedules, terrible for the messy work of caring about strangers. You start to recognize patterns in people, how they'll react, what they'll say next, the exact shape of their humor. You've met versions of this person before, dozens of times. The person in front of you is real and singular, yet the novelty tax becomes harder to pay. Each new friendship still costs the same energy it always did, but the reward, that spike of genuine newness, has shrunk to almost nothing. So you drift toward relationships where the work is already done. Your oldest friend doesn't need to surprise you anymore. They just need to show up on time. When someone new appears asking for that same investment of time and curious attention, you feel the cost more acutely than the gain. You're not cold. Your brain is simply running a calculation that the juice isn't worth the squeeze anymore. The move is small. Seek one genuinely interesting new person or group each year, not from guilt or obligation, from a deliberate choice to stay curious about the world, even when efficiency whispers that you've already seen enough. Emotional overhead fatigue. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your phone and suddenly realize you've been holding your breath? That's what happens to people in midlife when they've spent 20 years reading the room. Every text from an old friend carries a question. Should I respond right now or tomorrow? Will they interpret my tone as cold? What do they actually want from me? That invisible labor, the constant calculation of emotional subtext, becomes exhausting in a way that pure loneliness never is. By your 40s and 50s, you've decoded thousands of social interactions. You know exactly which friends need reassurance, which ones drain you, which ones will guilt you if you don't reach out first. That knowledge becomes a weight. It's not that you don't love them, it's that every friendship now requires a spreadsheet running in the background of your mind. Who owes whom a call? Who felt abandoned last time? Who might unload on you if you ask how they're doing? The arithmetic changes. A young person might have 5 friends and 4 relationships to manage. An older person might have 30 connections and feel responsible for all of them. The math gets cruel fast, so something shifts, not malice, but triage. You start cutting ties not because you've become cold, but because your brain is screaming for the lights to go out. Fewer friends means fewer tabs open. Fewer people to hold in your head. It's not rejection of others, it's a desperate bid for mental silence. And that silence, for so many, starts to feel like the only kind of rest they can afford. Small talk allergy. You're at a gathering, someone launches into weather observations, work complaints, local traffic, the usual script, and instead of the polite back and forth you used to manage, something rises in your chest. Not anger exactly, more like, why are we doing this? Why are we both pretending this matters when we could either say something real or just sit in quiet? That feeling has a name among older people, and it grows louder each year. It's not misanthropy, it's pattern recognition turned allergic. You have spent decades hearing the same conversational templates recycled. The office gossip, the weather complaint, the scheduled question answer nobody really wants. Your brain starts treating small talk like a substance it no longer tolerates. Each empty exchange feels like a small lie you're both agreeing to tell. The math shifts as you age. Small talk used to be a gateway, a way to build rapport before something deeper. Now you know the gateway rarely opens. Worse, those scripts eat up the actual time you have left with people. So you start cutting it out. You skip the event. You send a text instead of a call. You leave gatherings early. Surface conversation oils the wheels of society. It smooths friction. It greases connection. But the trade-off feels worth it to you now. Fewer shallow interactions and the possibility of something more honest with people who stick around. You're not becoming cold. You're becoming allergic to pretense, and in a world of endless small talk, that allergy starts to feel like the only honest response left. Authenticity becomes non-negotiable. You spend your 20s learning a foreign language nobody taught you, the dialect of other people's comfort. You laugh at jokes that don't land. You nod at opinions that make your skin crawl. You fold yourself into shapes that fit. Then somewhere in your 30s or 40s, your translator just stops working, not from rage or some dramatic break. It simply dies. Nobody talks about the fuel a false self burns through. Every conversation where you're performing instead of breathing is a small bleed. Every dinner where you're reading the room instead of being in it costs something. When you're young, it feels normal. Everyone's doing it. But by 45, you've logged thousands of hours as an understudy in your own life. You can see it now. You're not getting those hours back. So the pruning starts quietly. Friends who only call when they need something get fewer callbacks. Family members who demand the sanitized version of you get shorter answers. Colleagues who need you more confident, more compliant, more palatable just drift away. It looks like you've gotten colder. What actually happened is simpler. You did the math. You looked at what remains: time, attention, the space to actually be yourself, and you chose differently. The people who love the character you played sometimes call this betrayal. They're right about one thing: you've changed, but you haven't become smaller. You've become honest about what real closeness costs. You'd rather be alone than perform for a crowd. That's not isolation. That's the first moment you've ever actually chosen who gets to know you. Boundary muscle finally strengthens. When you're young, saying no feels like betrayal. Someone asks something of you, your time, your energy, your emotional labor, and your first instinct is guilt. You say yes to the thing that drains you, the friend who only calls when they need something, the family obligation that leaves you hollow. Because turning people away feels cruel, because you still believe that being good means being available. Then one day, usually somewhere in your 30s or 40s, something shifts. You realize you have less time than you thought. The years aren't infinite, and more quietly, you notice that some relationships have been one-way streets for decades. The person who never asks how you are. The one who cancels but expects you to be there. The voice that makes your stomach tighten before you even answer. Here's what actually happens. You don't become colder, you become honest. Boundaries aren't walls built from cruelty, they're fences built from self-respect. And that muscle, the one that says no without explaining, that walks away without guilt, that stops performing for people who don't see you, it gets strong only through repeated use. Younger, you didn't have that strength because you hadn't been hurt enough to need it, or you'd been hurt and didn't know you were allowed to heal by stepping back. Older, you knows the difference between loyalty and self-erasure. You know that protecting your own peace isn't selfish. It's the only way you have left to give anything real to anyone. So when people notice you've drifted, what they're seeing is you finally keeping promises, just not to them anymore. The promises are to yourself. Sunk cost friendship exits. You've known Derek for 17 years. He borrowed money once. He showed up late to your wedding, but you stay because you have 17 years invested, and walking away feels like admitting all that time was wasted. That feeling right there is the sunk cost fallacy doing its work on your friendships. Here's what happens. You're older now, busier, and your energy is genuinely finite. You start doing a quiet audit of who actually replenishes you. Derek doesn't make the list, but your brain screams that leaving means losing the investment, the inside jokes, the history, the person who knew you when. So you stay in a friendship that drains you because the past feels too valuable to let go. The trap deepens because sunk costs are invisible. You don't think, I'm staying because of 1999. You think it would be mean to just disappear, or maybe it'll get better. Your brain rewrites the math and makes the loss feel like integrity instead of what it is, throwing good time after bad. What shifts in midlife is a quieter realization. Staying in something dead doesn't honor the good years. It only wastes the next ones. The bravest exit isn't a betrayal of the past. It's a respect for your own future. Some friendships had their season, and knowing when a season ends isn't cruelty. It's maturity. The hardest part is letting yourself believe the 17 years were real and good and completely, finitely over. Values quietly diverge. You have a friend from college still in your phone, still invited to things. 20 years ago, you wanted the same life. You both laughed at the same jokes, made the same promises. Then somewhere around year 15, you noticed you weren't laughing anymore. Not because they changed, because what mattered to you had. Values don't announce their shift. They rewire slowly while you're busy living. A new job that makes you think differently about time. A child that reframes what safety means. A loss that burns away what seemed important. Your friend is still optimizing for the things their 25-year-old self valued. You're not. Here is what people rarely admit. This creates a quiet, specific kind of loneliness. You can sit across from someone you love and feel entirely alone because the thing you're protecting now, maybe it's solitude, maybe it's integrity, maybe it's a slower pace, doesn't register as valuable to them. They see you pulling away. They don't see the values pulling you. The drift doesn't feel like betrayal when it's happening. It feels like outgrowing a sweater, but the person wearing the old size doesn't understand why the new one won't fit. They take it personally. You feel misunderstood. So bit by bit, the messages get shorter, the visits space further apart, and eventually the relationship becomes a thing you loved, not a thing you have. The move is not to force sameness. It's to catch the divergence when it's still small, really see it, and ask whether connection still lives in the new shape or whether you're both just haunting the friendship that used to be there. Silent expectations collapse. You text a friend from years ago. The reply comes back flat, or worse, it doesn't come at all, and suddenly you realize you never actually told them what you needed from them. They didn't know, but somehow, over time, you stopped believing they would ever try to guess. As we get older, we build towering structures of unspoken rules inside our heads. You should call me on my birthday without being asked. You should remember that I'm stressed right now without me saying it. You should want to see me, not wait for an invite. These aren't requests. They're invisible ledgers. And when someone fails to read them, it feels like they failed to care. The trap is that we never checked if they even knew the ledger existed. Maybe they call on your birthday, just not the day you expected. Maybe they show up in different ways, texts instead of visits, gifts instead of time. But because it doesn't match the silent script, it registers as a miss. So you pull back, you figure if they cared, they would know. Two people silently keep score, each using a different rulebook, and neither one realizes the game is rigged. So we age, and the mismatches pile up. We cut people off not because they stopped caring, but because we stopped asking for what we needed in words. The people we cut off often don't even know why. Comparison exhaustion. You're midnight scrolling through someone's new house photos, square footage, renovations, timeline, the age they were when they bought it. Part of you can't stop doing the math, and suddenly you're tired in a way sleep won't fix. That exhaustion is the real culprit behind a lot of friendship fade-outs. By your 30s, 40s, 50s, you've spent decades watching people's lives unfold against yours. Someone got the promotion you didn't. Someone's kids turned out effortlessly brilliant. Someone married up, moved up, showed up exactly the way you thought you would by now. The comparison math becomes automatic. Your brain runs the calculation the moment you hear news, and you're not even choosing to do it anymore. Here's what gets you. Comparison doesn't just sting in the moment, it lingers. You see their wins and feel the weight of your own choices, timing, luck, or lack thereof. The feeling settles into your chest and stays. Because you already feel that weight, you start avoiding the person who carries it. Not consciously, you just don't text back as fast. You skip the coffee invite, too tired to celebrate. As you get older, you have less energy to spend on people who make you feel small. You can't afford it anymore. So you cut them off not because they did anything wrong, but because their existence became a mirror you couldn't stop looking into. Isolation becomes the quietest form of self-preservation. What shifts when you stop comparing? Everything softens, but that requires actually stopping, learning to hear someone's good news without running that exhausting math in your head. It's the hardest part. Drama immunity builds. You sit across from someone you've known for 2 decades, and they're venting about the same conflict again. Same names, same wound, same loop. And something in you just stops caring. Not because you're cruel, because you've watched this play 300 times. There's a peculiar thing that happens as you get older. You develop an allergy to circular suffering. You've seen enough people choose their pain over the way out of it. You've watched friendships die not from a single betrayal, but from someone's addiction to being wronged. The drama becomes visible not as tragedy, but as a pattern, and patterns bore you. What used to feel like loyalty, staying in the storm with someone, now reads as enabling. You start to notice that some people don't want solutions. They want an audience. They want your energy to fuel their complaint, your validation to make the hurt feel important. Staying means becoming a supporting character in someone else's refusal to change. The calculation happens almost without you. What will this friendship cost me in my finite time? How much of my oxygen does this person actually want versus how much they want to perform their suffering? If the answer tilts toward performance, something inside you quietly closes the door. As you get older, you don't cut people off because you're shallow. You cut them off because you've become allergic to potential, to watching someone you care about stay small, stay hurt, stay stuck. Your presence in their chaos isn't grace anymore. Sometimes it's permission to stay broken, and that's when the mercy is letting go. Solitude preference reverses. You remember being the person who needed the buzz, crowds, late nights, the sense that something might happen. It pulled you like gravity. Even quiet weekends felt like they were missing something. Now, sitting in your own house on a Saturday with nowhere to be, you feel something closer to relief than loss. What flipped? The noise tolerance changed first. Conversations that used to feel energizing now feel like they require a translation service. Small talk, the social scaffolding that used to be background music, has become foreground work. You notice you're editing yourself more. The stories you don't tell, the opinions you swallow, the parts of you that don't fit the available slots in other people's attention. But here's the quieter shift. Solitude stopped being something you tolerate and started being something you actually want. Not isolation out of hurt or rejection, but genuine preference. An hour alone tastes better than an hour performing yourself. Your own thoughts feel like better company than half listening while someone talks about their job. The trap is mistaking this for wisdom. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just tiredness that looks like preference. The real risk is waking up at 60 and realizing you've built a life so quiet that reconnecting feels impossible. Not because you don't want people, but because you've become a master at not needing them, and that's harder to undo. The move is small. Notice the difference between choosing solitude and defaulting to it. One feels like freedom. The other feels like the door slowly closing and you're still holding the key. Rumination reduction strategy. 3 a.m. and you're replaying a conversation from 3 weeks back. Suddenly angrier than you were the day it happened. That loop in your head, that's rumination. Your brain is convinced that if you just think about it enough, replay it enough, analyze it from every angle, you'll finally solve it. Except you won't. Rumination never solved anything. It just digs the groove deeper. As you get older, something shifts. The people you see less often don't pull you into these spirals anymore, not because you've become cold, but because distance changes the math. You're not cutting them off. You're just running fewer loops. Your nervous system votes with its feet. Here's the actual mechanics of it. Replaying an interaction doesn't change what happened, doesn't make you right in hindsight, and doesn't make them suddenly understand you. It just burns your night and your energy. So you stop needing them in the way you used to, not because you've decided to reject them, but because you've stopped needing to rehearse the entire relationship with them or process it endlessly with someone else. The move is simple. When you catch yourself spinning, ask yourself straight up, am I solving this or am I rehearsing it? If you're rehearsing, you name it. You step back. Some days you succeed, most days you don't. But each time you catch the loop, it loosens a little. People drift away not because you've turned ruthless, but because you've gotten tired of the tax rumination charges. And that's not loneliness. That's your mind finally learning to keep itself. One-sided effort tallying. You text first, always first. Then one day you realize you're the only one reaching out and something in you just closes. It's not a dramatic door slam. It's quieter than that. The slow decision to stop counting, which is exactly when the counting starts to matter most. Your brain keeps a ledger without your permission. Who called last? Who asked about your life? Who showed up when things were hard? We're wired to notice imbalance in relationships that matter, and that ledger becomes impossible to ignore. You start tracking not because you're petty, but because tracking feels like evidence of something true, that you care more than you're cared for. Effort tallying is invisible work. You're not keeping a spreadsheet, but your nervous system is keeping score. After enough one-sided months, your body simply refuses to reach out again. It's not punishment, it's exhaustion dressed up as clarity. Your phone stays in your pocket. Some friendships are lopsided because life gets uneven. Someone's in crisis, isolated, drowning. But when the pattern never shifts, when seasons change and effort flows only one direction, your older self decides it's not worth the toll. You have less time now, less tolerance for performance. The quiet ending happens in this invisible ledger, not because you're angry, because you're finally tired of being the only one keeping the fire lit. And that reframe matters. It's not cruelty. It's protection of what little energy you have left to give people who actually meet you halfway. The ledger was never the problem. the one-way street was. Trust bankruptcy declared. By 40, you've watched enough people fail to show up. The friend who borrowed money and vanished. The family member who promised forever and chose easier. The colleague who smiled at your face and sabotaged your back. Each one doesn't just hurt. It leaves a small wound in your willingness to believe anyone again. And after enough wounds, something shifts. Not overnight, slowly. You stop extending the rope. Here's what nobody tells you. Trust isn't a single decision you make about one person. It's a running account. Every promise kept makes a deposit. Every lie, every cancellation, every time someone prioritized themselves while asking you to sacrifice, that's a withdrawal. And by the time you're older, a lot of people have cleaned out the bank. The metaphor sounds cold because it is. You're not being dramatic when you pull back. You're being practical. The tricky part is that pulling back feels like wisdom. You tell yourself you're protecting something precious, your peace, your time, your heart, and you're right. But the invisible cost is that you might also be protecting yourself out of connection. You become safe. You become untouched. You become alone without quite noticing the door locked behind you. The question isn't whether to trust blindly again. It's whether you can afford to let one person fail without filing the entire human race as too expensive. That's where the real work lives, not in reopening the door to everyone, but in learning to close it on one betrayal without locking out the whole world. Grief drives withdrawal. You lose someone, a parent, a friend, a version of yourself you thought would last forever. And suddenly, the group chat feels like a lie. All that brightness and inside jokes become instruments of a world that kept spinning without them. So you stop reaching back. Not out of anger, out of a kind of necessary silence. Grief does not move you through stages and spit you out cleaner on the other side. It rewires how the world feels. The people around you mean well, but their continued aliveness can sting. Laughing at a dinner table now feels like betrayal. Planning next month's trip feels obscene when that person will not be there. So withdrawal becomes a way to protect both them and yourself from the weight you are carrying. Here is what happens over years. You pull back once and people understand. You pull back twice and they start inviting less. By the third time, the invitations stop. The isolation feels earned now. You have grown used to grief as a companion, and letting new people in means explaining why you are the way you are now, means saying the person's name out loud. The trap is gradual. Grief shrinks your world, and shrinking worlds feel safer. What starts as a necessary pause in 2015 calcifies into a pattern by 2025. The people who might have walked alongside your grief, not fixing it, just witnessing it, have long stopped trying, and you are left with the person you became when you stopped letting anyone see you change. Identity finally crystallizes. Around 35 or 40, something quiet shifts. The version your parents needed, the mask that played well at parties, the personality your boss expected, they all lose their grip. You don't decide this consciously. One day you just stop reaching for them, and suddenly the people who only knew those versions feel like strangers wearing familiar faces. What solidified underneath is your actual self, your values hardened from clay into something closer to stone. You know what you genuinely like now, not what you thought you should like. You know the difference between loneliness and solitude, between real ambition and pretense. That clarity feels like coming home. It's also merciless. The friction shows up next, quiet at first. You're sitting with someone and realize they don't fit this clearer version of you. Not because they're bad people, just mismatched. A friend who thrives on chaos when you've chosen quiet. A family member whose entire priority system never aligned with yours. A former best friend built on shared teenage rebellion that doesn't speak to your bones anymore. The friction becomes impossible to ignore. Here's where the cutting off happens. You mistake crystallization for permission. Yes, you've grown. You've learned yourself deeply. But that knowledge, without tenderness toward those left behind, becomes something else. Cold culling dressed up as self-respect. Some people you genuinely outgrow. Others you're seeing clearly for the first time, and that clarity reveals you are never truly aligned. The move worth making is sitting long enough to know which is which, and whether they deserve to hear the real reason before you fade. Mask removal relief. You know that exhale that happens the moment you close the front door after work or a family dinner. The shoulders drop, the face relaxes, the voice changes. For decades, you have been curating which version of yourself shows up in which room. The professional one, the agreeable one, the small talk one, the one who laughs at jokes they do not find funny. That takes real energy, a constant background hum of self-monitoring that most people just learn to ignore. By your 40s and 50s, something shifts. Some people wake up tired, not just physically, but down to the bone. The daily calculation starts to feel less like responsibility and more like a performance you're stuck running on your own life. So they begin cutting away the relationships that require the most mask wearing. Not necessarily the mean ones, but the ones where the facade has gotten heaviest. People who only know the curated version of you. What rarely gets named, that amputation can feel like genuine relief. Like finally setting down a weight so old you forgot you were even carrying it. You are not becoming coldly selective. You are becoming honest about who you have energy left to maintain a persona around. The people who stay tend to be the ones in front of whom you can simply exist. No brand, no history to perform. The trap is calling isolation authenticity and stopping there. The real move is gentler. Ask yourself who you can be less curated around and whether those people actually exist in your current circle. Sometimes you do not need to cut people off. Sometimes you just need to let the mask slip a little and see who sticks around anyway. Social mirroring fatigue. You know that moment after a long dinner party. You've laughed at jokes that weren't funny, nodded along to opinions you didn't share, kept your real thoughts locked down. You call it introversion, but something else is happening underneath. You've been mirroring. Every social moment asks you to adjust. You soften your language. You match the energy in the room. You become slightly less yourself in exchange for belonging. The drain compounds across decades. In your 20s, this felt like a fair trade. You wanted in, wanted to be liked, wanted options open, but by 40 or 50, you've mirrored thousands of times. You know which parts of you people find difficult. You've learned which truths make others uncomfortable, which jokes fall flat, which vulnerabilities disconnect you. The arithmetic gets harsh. Stay connected, stay small. That's when people start disappearing from everyone's life, not from rage or cruelty, but from a bone-deep tiredness. It's simpler to not show up than to show up and edit yourself. Easier to skip the group chat than to read through jokes and decide whether to perform enthusiasm. Easier to be alone than lonely in a room of people who only know the polished version. The quiet part nobody says. Many older people who withdraw aren't rejecting others. They're exhausted from translating. They've spent a lifetime deciding which parts are safe. At some point, the cost stops feeling worth the price. If you see this pattern in someone close, sometimes one thing matters. proving they don't need to translate, that you can handle the whole person, not the version they've learned to show. Reciprocity ledger runs red. Your brain keeps score in a way your conscious mind pretends it doesn't. Not written anywhere, but tracked with the precision reserved for hurt. Who showed up when you needed them, whose birthday you remembered year after year while yours arrived in silence, who called at midnight asking for an ear but never offered one when the tables turned. By your 40s or 50s, if you've been paying attention, those columns stop adding up. The arithmetic gets brutal fast. Relationships that run one direction long enough stop feeling like connection and start feeling like debt. You drive to see them, they never make the trip. You listen to their problems for hours while they scroll their phone during yours. You give, they take. Your brain, wired by thousands of years of survival to track fairness, notices every single imbalance. Reciprocity isn't some nice social gesture, it's the ground beneath trust. Without it, showing up stops feeling like generosity and starts feeling like a transaction you're always losing. What shifts with time isn't your need for connection. It's your patience for one that drains you. When you were younger, you might have absorbed the imbalance, told yourself they were busy or different, or that real friendship was supposed to be unconditional anyway. But year after year, watching that ledger tick further into red, something changes. You stop calling back as quickly. You decline the next invitation. You let those one-way streets fade into quiet distance. It's not bitterness exactly. It's finally deciding your limited time is worth more than an audience that never shows up for you. Overstimulation, avoidance. Think about the last time you were genuinely exhausted, not tired, but hollowed out. Your nervous system felt like it had been running at 110% all day, and the smallest noise made you flinch. Now imagine that feeling becoming your default. That is often what happens as we age. Your capacity for sensory noise, emotional drama, and social unpredictability shrinks, and what once felt tolerable, a crowded bar, a chaotic group chat, a friend's constant crisis cycling, starts to feel like sandpaper on raw skin. The body keeps score differently than it used to. A younger version of you could absorb a house full of people, competing conversations, unexpected plans. You had buffer space. Now that buffer is smaller and people feel the difference as distance. You cancel more. You decline invitations. You mute group conversations. It is not coldness. It is self-preservation. Your nervous system is being honest about what it can hold. Here is the thing nobody warns you about. Other people feel rejected before they feel understood. A friend interprets your quiet withdrawal as a statement about them, not a simple fact about your thresholds. They do not see the calculation that spending 4 hours together means you need 8 hours alone after. They just feel the thinning of the friendship. The move is not to pretend you have unlimited capacity. The move is to be explicit about it early before resentment builds. Tell people what overstimulation feels like for you, what your actual limits are, and that those limits are real. It reframes everything from rejection to clarity. Emotional labor rationing. A text from an old friend lands in your phone, and instead of joy, you feel tired. Not because you don't care about them, because responding, really responding, holding space for their story, remembering what you discussed last time, managing the rhythm of their emotional needs, costs something you have less of now. That something is emotional labor, and it is finite. When you are young, your battery feels infinite. You can absorb other people's drama, remember their birthdays unprompted, text back immediately, sit through the whole sad story. But by your 40s or 50s, you have likely learned through hard experience that energy is a real resource. You have your own stuff, work that drains you, a body that needs sleep, your own grief or anxiety underneath. You start doing the math without even realizing it. Every relationship is a debit, so you begin choosing differently. You answer fewer texts, you decline more invitations, you stop pretending to remember details you never actually cared about. It is not cruelty, it is arithmetic. You have learned that saying yes to everyone means burning out, and burnout means you have nothing left for the people who matter most or for yourself. Withdrawing is often rational, not a flaw, but it can slide into something quieter and riskier. Sometimes the calculus gets so tight, you start rationing from people who would have given back if you had asked. The work is checking whether you are protecting your peace or just protecting yourself from the vulnerability of needing anyone at all. Circle pruning ritual. Somewhere around your 30s or 40s, you notice you've been saying yes to people out of habit, not hunger. A cousin's birthday dinner that leaves you drained. A co-worker's group chat that buzzes all weekend. An old friend whose calls always feel like obligation wearing a smile. You don't hate them, but you notice something. The energy required to maintain these ties costs you something real. Sleep, mood, the space in your head you'd rather fill with anything else. What happens next looks less like cruelty and more like arithmetic. Your nervous system does the math before your brain can. This person, this group, this recurring dinner, what am I actually getting from this besides the guilt of not showing up? And what am I losing? Time, peace, the chance to be fully present somewhere I actually want to be. The answers feel less like opinions and more like facts. The ritual begins quietly. You stop initiating. You answer slower. You decline the next invitation with a reason that's true, but not the whole truth. Most people don't notice. Some do, and they feel it as rejection. A few try to reclaim you, but most fade because they were never really invested either. They were just stuck in the same pattern as you were. This isn't heartlessness. It's selectivity. A full circle isn't a badge of honor. It's a recipe for resentment and small talk. The people worth keeping are the ones who don't need you to perform. Everyone else is just taking up space where real connection could breathe. Loyalty tests keep failing. You text a friend something vulnerable and get back a thumbs up emoji. You mention a problem and they change the subject. You keep showing up and they don't quite show up back. Small moments that pile up until, by your 40s, you are exhausted from the arithmetic of it all. A loyalty test is not always some grand gesture. It's you saying something that matters and noticing whether they ask follow-up questions. It's you struggling and watching whether they remember without being reminded. It's you keeping their secret, then discovering they told someone else. These quiet failures accumulate, layer by layer, until the weight becomes unbearable. The brutal part is realizing you cannot force reciprocity. You cannot make someone care as much as you do. You can only keep score for so long before the ledger breaks your heart. Eventually, you stop offering the test altogether, not out of anger, but out of a quiet surrender. Why keep asking people to prove they want you around? So, the cutting off is not always dramatic. It is often a slow rotation away from people who are never going to pass anyway. You are not suddenly cold. You are finally tired. The loyalty tests kept failing because they were never really tests at all. They were just you, hoping someone would care the way you care, watching to see if they would notice when it mattered. When that hope dies, the friendship dies with it. And here's the small grace. Cutting off people who fail, the unspoken test, is sometimes the first honest thing you do for yourself in years. Gossip, contamination, fear. You tell one friend something soft about your marriage. 3 weeks later, that story has developed a life of its own. It's been edited, mixed with someone else's divorce, and now it's circulating at book club as proof that you're unhappy. You feel like your private life got ransacked and renamed. As you get older, you realize that information is currency in social circles, and currency gets spent. A confession shared in confidence doesn't stay confined. It gets weaponized in arguments between mutual friends. It gets softened into gossip. It gets attached to your name like a permanent label. The more you've lived, the more you've seen this happen. You've watched reputations shift over one misunderstood comment. You've seen people turned into punchlines by the very people they thought cared. So you start cutting ties, not because the friendships were bad, but because you've learned that every word can become a story that no longer belongs to you. Keeping people at arm's length feels like the only way to keep your world intact. You share less, trust less, reach out less. The risk of contamination, of your secrets, your struggles, your messy human moments becoming entertainment for others feels too high to ignore. Here's the thing though, that fear is real and justified, but it can also flatten your life into a fortress. The people worth keeping around are the ones who've earned the right to know you by proving they don't weaponize what you tell them. They're rare, yes, but they're not as rare as isolation makes it feel. The answer isn't no friends. It's smaller circles with higher standards. Codependency detox. You spend the afternoon listening to someone else's problem, then the evening, then you're lying awake at 2 a.m., your stomach tight the moment your phone buzzes. Not because something's wrong, but because part of you has learned to need to be needed. That's the trap. Codependency is when your emotional oxygen comes from managing someone else's life. You feel responsible for their mood, their choices, their survival. You apologize for their anger. You organize around their schedule. You become the emotional scaffolding they forgot to build for themselves. And for years, this doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like love. It feels like maturity. It feels like proof you're a good person. But here's what happens as you get older. You start to notice the cost. You realize you haven't had a genuine conversation in months, only crisis management and damage control. You see how your sacrifice has made them less capable, not safer. You recognize that staying small, staying available, staying guilty has hollowed you out. The tiredness isn't love anymore, it's depletion. So people cut these relationships off not because they've become cold, but because they've finally become honest. Pulling away from codependency isn't rejection, it's self-preservation. And the people who can't let that happen, who insist you owe them your life, they stay. Everyone else gets silence. The move isn't punishment. It's learning that taking care of yourself isn't selfish, that real love doesn't require you to disappear, that your presence should add to your life, not subtract from it. That's when the older, quieter version of you emerges. Approval, addiction, recovery. Somewhere in your 30s or 40s, you realize you've been performing the whole time, not on a stage, in your actual kitchen, your actual relationships, your actual skin. Every text has an invisible question mark. Every choice funnels through the same filter. What will they think? How will they judge me for this? And then the exhaustion arrives, and it doesn't leave. The people who suddenly ghost their entire world aren't typically monsters. Many are just people who finally stopped the show. They're fed up with the unspoken deal, where love always comes with conditions, where approval is currency and scarcity is the rule. They're tired of the voice in their head that sounds like every person who ever withheld praise or warmth, and they realize that borrowed voice has been steering their whole life. What outsiders call isolation often feels like oxygen to them, the first clean breath in years. No performance metrics, no invisible scorecard watching every move. But here's where it gets tricky. Cutting everyone off doesn't actually heal the addiction to approval. It just removes the audience. The meter is still there, still running, still keeping score. It just aims inward now instead of outward. The real work isn't vanishing. It's learning to choose without checking the approval dial first. It's staying in the room with people while also accepting that not everyone will get it or like it, and discovering that's okay anyway. That quieter, much harder path, becoming your own audience, learning that your own nod is enough, that's where the walls come down. Regret minimization's instinct. You turn 50 and an old friend texts. They want to catch up. Your stomach tightens. You scroll and think, what if they disappoint me again? What if they bring drama? So you don't answer. It feels safer than it ever has. Here's what's happening inside that hesitation. Your emotional bandwidth doesn't grow as you age. It compresses. You've lived long enough to see patterns repeat. Some people burned you. Some friendships were one-sided for years. Your brain, now calibrated by decades of small wounds, makes a ruthless equation. Any friendship that might go wrong is worse than none at all. This is regret minimization, not coldness, not wisdom wearing armor, arithmetic. The younger you could absorb a bad friendship, bounce back, file it away as learning, the older you calculates differently, less time left, less resilience for betrayal, less patience for people who don't show up the way you do. The math feels airtight. The trap is treating potential friendships like stock portfolios, cutting anything risky before it can hurt. But relationships aren't investments with predictable downside. They're about knowing the difference between someone who's actually failed you before and someone you're simply afraid of. One is a pattern. The other is preemptive loneliness wearing wisdom's costume. When you feel the urge to cut someone off early, sit with this. Am I protecting myself from real patterns or just from the feeling of being hurt again? That distinction changes everything. One keeps you safe, the other keeps you alone. Attachment style shifts. You used to text back in minutes. Birthdays lived in your head rent-free. You showed up early because the ritual mattered, the waiting, the greeting, the proof that you cared enough to be there first. Somewhere in your late 30s or 40s, that person quietly retired. Not because you stopped loving people, because what love requires from you changed. Your attachment system didn't just shift, it recalibrated. The anxiety that once drove you to overgive, to prove worth through endless availability, started to feel like drowning in slow motion. You had survived enough disappointments and unmet needs to recognize something hard. You cannot control how others feel about you, and the trying will hollow you out. So you pulled back, not coldly, strategically. The nervous energy that used to fill silences got redirected into solitude, hobbies, the few relationships where reciprocity actually existed. Here is where it gets tricky. You stopped abandoning yourself to prevent abandonment. You stopped earning love through needlessness. That is real maturity. But the people still expecting the old version of you, the eager respondent, the emotional laborer, the reassurance machine, they feel your withdrawal as rejection. They cannot see that you simply drew a line. The quiet danger is mistaking recalibration for permission to vanish, detachment posing as wisdom. There is a real difference between choosing company carefully and choosing isolation. One is boundary setting, the other is wall building. People do not actually leave because you know your worth now. They leave when you stop showing them that worth runs both directions. Nostalgia versus reality gap. A text arrives from someone you used to orbit around. Your stomach lifts. The whole friendship floods back in high color. Then they suggest meeting up, and something in you just locks. Not anger, something quieter. You realize you are grieving a version of that friendship that never actually existed except in the reels your memory has been editing for years. Here is what happened. Your brain softened the friction, amplified the laughter, cut out the small resentments and the times they let you down. The real friendship was never that clean, but nostalgia does not know the difference between what happened and what you wished had happened. So, when you see them again, the collision is fast. They are busier. Small talk feels wrong. They do not laugh like they used to, or maybe they do, but not like you remembered, and instead of adjusting, you just close the door. It feels safer to cut it than to stand in the space between the myth and the person sitting across from you. The trap grows sharper as you age because you have decades of friendships to polish into gold. Every connection from 20 years back glows. Every current one feels pale by comparison. You isolate not because people hurt you, but because reality never matches the story your mind has been polishing in the dark. The hard part? The friendship you miss was never real. What was real was good enough, messy, uncertain, but present. That only lives now, in people who show up today. And that means releasing the ghost version first. Conflict avoidance economics. You meet an old friend for coffee and they mention something that stings. You could push back. You could say what you really think. Instead, you smile, nod, and make a quiet note to skip the next invitation. The math is simple in your head. The emotional cost of that argument minus the actual friendship payoff equals not worth it. As you age, you start running a private ledger. Every conflict has a tax. An uncomfortable conversation might take 3 hours out of your week. The actual fight, the thinking about it afterward, the small distance it creates between you. A relationship that requires that much emotional currency starts to feel like a bad investment. Young you argued because you believed in repair. Older you cuts because you've learned that some people charge more than they're worth. The trap is that this calculation feels rational, even practical. You tell yourself you're protecting your peace, drawing a sensible boundary. But what's actually happening is quieter and more costly. You're outsourcing the hard work of being truly known. Real closeness requires friction sometimes. It requires saying the thing that might sting, then sitting in the discomfort until something truer emerges between you both. Avoidance is cheaper in the moment. It's also invisible. Nobody can prove they lost something they never knew they had. So ask yourself this before you fade on someone. Are you cutting them off because they're genuinely toxic or because maintaining them requires something you've decided you're too tired to give? Because those are very different decisions. One protects you, the other quietly starves you. Money exposes true friends. You lend a friend $500, something you can absorb, but not without noticing it gone. They say yes like it's nothing, promise to pay you back next month. 6 months later, they mention it casually as if it never happened. You bring it up carefully. Suddenly, they're offended. You're the problem, apparently, for caring about money. That's when the fog lifts. Money doesn't change people, it reveals them. The person who treats a loan like a debt of honor, who checks in before you have to ask, who hates owing anyone, that's your person. The one who conveniently forgets, who gets defensive when reminded, who measures your friendship against your usefulness to them, now you know exactly what you're dealing with. No ambiguity left. Here's what older people learn. You can't actually know someone's character until it's tested, and money is one of the cleanest tests there is. It's not fuzzy like a mean comment or a forgotten birthday. It's concrete. Did they pay it back? Are they honest about why they couldn't? Do they respect your boundaries around it, or do they treat the whole thing as optional? The cutting off that happens later isn't punishment. It's clarity finally becoming action. You stop trying to be close to people who've already shown you exactly what their integrity looks like. You were waiting for them to change. Instead, you just got older and tired of managing the gap between who you hoped they were and who they actually are. So you drift. Not out of bitterness, but because money showed you something money can't fix. Political tribes fracture bonds. You used to laugh at your uncle's jokes. Then an election happened, and suddenly you're not sure you want him at your table anymore. Not because he betrayed you, but because his political views feel like a personal rejection of your values, your intelligence, maybe even your morality. And if your morality is wrong, who are you? What happens in political polarization is that your team stops being just a preference and becomes your identity. The tribe you vote for isn't separate from you anymore. It's woven into your sense of self. So when someone you love disagrees, your brain doesn't register it as a difference of opinion. It registers as a threat to who you are. Your amygdala lights up. Your defenses rise. This is why you notice older people cutting ties more sharply around politics. They've had decades to build a coherent sense of who they are and which tribe they belong to. Changing your mind feels like erasing yourself. People rarely choose erasure. Distance feels like protection. If Aunt Linda is no longer invited, you don't have to feel that cognitive dissonance anymore. You don't have to hold the impossible thought that someone you love could be deeply misguided about something you consider foundational. Easier to cut the thread than to sit with both truths at once. The quiet move. Remind yourself that their vote is not their whole self. You can disagree on everything and still like them. It's hard, but it's the only way the older you doesn't wake up one day realizing there's nobody left to call. Parenting phase isolates. You're sitting in the parking lot of your kid's soccer practice at 6 p.m. on a Friday night, and your phone buzzes with 3 friends asking if you're free. You are not. You will not be free for another hour. Then there's dinner, bath time, homework you didn't assign yourself. By the time everyone's asleep, you are flattened. The group chat scrolls by unwatched. The standing dinner reservation gets canceled. Again, parenting doesn't just fill your time, it colonizes your identity. You become the guy with kids. Your friends without them are still doing things at 8 p.m. on Thursdays. Spontaneity dies. And because no one quite planned it, you start saying no more often than yes. The invitations slow down. The inside jokes stop hitting. You miss the context. But here's what cuts deeper. Friends without kids live in a different world now. Their conversations, their freedom, their complaints, they feel foreign. Meanwhile, you're the only one in the group who understands why you can't do anything without a babysitter or why you're exhausted talking about it. So you both back away, not out of anger, but out of honest mismatch. The real trap is how easy it becomes to stay isolated even when the schedule finally loosens. The friendships have atrophied. The habits are set. You've built a smaller circle, maybe just other parents, and reaching back to the old one feels like admitting you vanished. You didn't vanish. You were locked in a room. But by the time the door opens, the muscle memory of solitude is already strong. And it holds. Health forces a reset. A diagnosis arrives on a Tuesday. Maybe it's a scare, maybe it's chronic, maybe it's just the slow creep of aging, but suddenly you're sitting in a waiting room doing the math on your own mortality, and something shifts, not dramatically at first, just a small clarification about what actually matters. The people who drained your energy before, they start to feel like a luxury you can no longer afford, a friend who only calls when they need something, a sibling who leaves you feeling smaller, a group chat that's turned into performance art. When your body is teaching you about limits, your patience for performance dies fast. Health is the great clarifier because it's involuntary. You cannot negotiate with fatigue or reframe your way out of recovery time. This forces a brutal honesty that most of us avoid. You simply do not have enough energy for everyone. And the moment you know that, pretending otherwise becomes a burden you cannot carry. What happens next is not cruelty, it's triage. You cut people not from anger, but from arithmetic. The math is simple. Energy in, energy out. Some relationships subtract, some add nothing. Some people only show up when you are useful, and a health scare makes you useless in useful ways. The strange gift is that you stop apologizing for it. Before illness, you might have felt guilty for withdrawing. After, guilt is a luxury you cannot afford. You protect what you have left. The people who love you understand. The ones who don't, well, that clarity is its own kind of kindness. Empty calorie relationships. You know that friend you text back after 3 weeks? The one where the conversation always loops the same way. Surface catch-ups, no depth, no real movement. You walk away from coffee feeling like you didn't eat. That's an empty calorie relationship, and as you age, your appetite for them just dies. The thing is, you didn't suddenly become cold. You became hungry. When you're young, novelty masks the hollowness. Just being around people feels like enough. But somewhere in your 30s or 40s, your brain starts keeping score differently. It stops measuring friendship by hours and measures it by felt presence, by whether someone actually listens to your answer, by whether they'd show up at 2 a.m. if the night went dark. Relationships that ask for presence but give nothing back start to feel like a leak. You're pouring in attention, memory, emotional energy, and the other person is on autopilot. They're not bad people. They're just not feeding you. And you've learned the hard way that time is the only currency you can't earn back. So you don't cut them off maliciously. You just stop initiating. You let the space widen because your bandwidth is finite and your tolerance for performance has evaporated. You'd rather sit alone than sit with someone and feel lonely anyway. That's not isolation speaking. That's your system recalibrating what matters. The quieter move is to notice it early, not when you're already resentful, but when you first feel that hollow flutter after leaving someone's company. That feeling is your inner compass, and it's worth paying attention to. Depth over breadth, pivot. A dinner party ends and you drive home. Your mind doesn't linger on the 12 people you met. It lands on one, the woman you talked to for 20 minutes who actually listened. The rest blur. That's when you know something has shifted. Quantity of connection doesn't fill the same room anymore. Around your 40s or 50s, your tolerance for surface-level friendship hits a wall. You've had enough small talk to recognize it as a placeholder. You've sat through enough conversations about nothing to feel the weight of it, that low-grade ache that comes from being in the same room with someone who doesn't know what you care about. The people who stay are the ones asking real questions. They know your history without needing a recap. They don't drain you with their neediness or their noise. There's a practical piece too. You have less time, not just in your week, but in your life. That awareness, whether spoken or silent, makes you ruthless about who gets those hours. A casual friend from work? 5 years ago, coffee. Now you ask, do I actually want this person to know me? Do I want to know them? The people you cut aren't always bad. Many are fine, perfectly fine, but fine doesn't cut it anymore. You need people who enlarge you somehow, who make you think differently, who love you in a way that feels specific to who you actually are, not who you performed being at 25. The loneliness that follows isn't always sadness. Sometimes it's relief. You've finally made room for the real thing. Vulnerability hangover. You tell someone something real at dinner, a fear, a mistake, something that cost you. In the moment it felt good, maybe even necessary. Then you drive home and the feeling shifts. Your chest tightens. You replay what you said. You think about how they're probably thinking of you differently now, smaller, less capable. By morning, you just want to disappear before they do. That dread is the vulnerability hangover. It's the emotional tax you pay for showing up honestly, and it sticks around long enough to make you swear you'll never do it again. Your brain didn't file that as, I felt brave and connected. It filed it as, I exposed myself and now I'm at risk. So the next time they invite you somewhere or ask how you're really doing, there's friction. A little voice says, don't go there again. Over years, these hangovers pile up, not because people rejected you, but because your nervous system learned to fear the letdown that came after the opening. You start choosing people and situations where you don't have to risk that crash. Safer people, lighter conversations, smaller circles. The loneliness that follows isn't about rejection. It's about the cost of feeling safe. You withdraw, not because anyone hurt you, but because being known started to feel more dangerous than being alone. Isolation becomes the thing you choose again and again to avoid that particular ache. Each hangover is a small vote against connection, and eventually those votes add up to a life where few people ever really know you. Status mismatch stings. Your old friend posts a photo from somewhere you cannot afford. Their kid attends private school. They mention the promotion, the house, the sabbatical, and suddenly the friendship feels smaller. Not because they changed, because the gap between what you have and what they have became visible, and visibility is poison to old relationships. Status mismatch is not really about money. It is about standing in a different room now, even when you are sitting at the same table. If they have risen and you have stayed still, or worse, if you fell while they climbed, your shared history starts to feel like a reminder of what you could not match. Every text, every plan becomes a small confrontation with that gap. Your brain runs a quiet arithmetic. Do I have less? Do I seem smaller to them now? And if the answer feels like yes, the easiest move is to disappear before they notice. The trap is that you blame them for changing. But what actually shifted is the comparison. Here is what makes it cruel. The friendships that die this way are often the ones that held you when status did not matter at all. People do not leave because status matters to them. They leave because they suspect it matters to the other person. They are running from an imagined judgment rather than a real one. If you feel this sting, pause long enough to ask yourself, am I leaving because they rejected me, or am I leaving to reject them first? That single question can save a friendship that never needed saving. Jealousy detection sharpens. You're in your late 30s when a friend mentions someone else's promotions and you hear it. Not the words, but the weight underneath them. They laugh at your new house and you clock the half-second delay before the sound arrives. The micro expressions you missed in your 20s are now neon signs. You weren't born reading envy like this. Time just taught you fluently. Part of it is fair intelligence. Jealousy gets louder once you've felt its full sting, the kind that wakes you at 3 a.m., the kind that sticks. You know the careful phrasing people use when they're genuinely happy for you versus the version where happiness is half strangled. You've watched people shrink when your good news landed instead of theirs. You've seen the slow cold creep in, so your radar hardens. That 12-hour text delay, they're irritated. Plans fell through again. They don't want to witness your life. Your success became their mirror, and mirrors make people defensive. You start reading threat into ordinary rhythms, pattern matching like a casino security feed. Here's what gets you, though. Sometimes your read is accurate. People do pull back. Jealousy is real, and it does corrode relationships. But sometimes a delay is just chaos. A cancellation is just a calendar conflict. A short reply is just exhaustion. By cutting first, you never sit with the ambiguity long enough to know what's true. You end up with only people who already won or already quit wanting to, which feels safe until you notice it feels isolated. The radar kept you right. It also kept you alone. Emotional contagion protection. You walk into a room where someone is anxious, and within minutes, your chest tightens. You spend an hour with someone bitter, and you find yourself noticing slights everywhere. You are not choosing this. Your nervous system is catching their weather like a virus. Mirror neurons fire. Stress hormones sink. By midlife, you recognize it happening in real time, and you recognize it as real. A younger version of you might have believed you could absorb someone else's pain and turn it into compassion. By 45, you know better. You have spent decades watching other people's chaos reshape your own inner weather. The fatigue is not romantic. It is bone deep, and it accumulates. The withdrawal that comes later is not cruelty. It is clarity about what your nervous system can actually hold. You have maybe 2 or 3 relationships where emotional labor feels mutual. Adding a 4th person whose anxiety runs on loop, or a sibling whose resentment never leaves the room, that is not connection anymore. That is your system absorbing frequencies you did not choose and cannot turn off. So you stop picking up. Not from hardness, but because you have finally learned to trust what your own body is telling you. When someone consistently leaves you feeling smaller, more afraid, or more resentful than you felt before the conversation, staying costs you something real. You are protecting the one thing you cannot get back. The emotional coherence that lets you show up for the people and work that actually matter. Growth, mismatch, resentment. You start therapy, you read differently, you change what you tolerate, and suddenly the friend who felt like a mirror for 20 years feels like a stranger reading from an old script. They still make the same joke at the same person's expense. They still can't sit with quiet. They're still afraid of looking inward. Nothing about them has shifted, but everything about your relationship to them has, and that gap starts to feel like betrayal. What gets under your skin isn't who they are, it's who they're not becoming. You can see the path forward, the conversation they could have, the defense they could drop. You've walked it yourself, felt it open up, and now you're watching them choose the familiar pain instead. When you try to share what you've learned, they don't want it. They want the old version of you, the one who laughed at the joke too, who kept the same small fears, who didn't ask hard questions. The resentment builds quietly because it feels righteous. You're trying to grow. They're staying still. But here's the trap. You're measuring their worth by your pace, your timeline, your version of better, and when they don't match it, you disappear. Sometimes that's necessary. Some people are genuinely stuck in ways that hurt you, but sometimes you're grieving a friend who was never meant to evolve at your speed, at your cost. The hard move is accepting that people grow on different schedules or not at all without making their stillness feel like a personal rejection of who you've become. That acceptance is what separates a choice from a sentence. Chronic disappointment adaptation. By your 40s or 50s, you've been let down enough times that your nervous system starts running a different calculation. Not consciously, but at some level, you realize that hoping for people to show up, remember things, or follow through is setting yourself up for that small sting. So your brain does what brains do when they encounter repeated pain. It builds a buffer. It makes withdrawal look like wisdom. The withdrawal feels protective. You stop telling people your real plans so you're not disappointed when they bail. You stop calling first so rejection doesn't land as hard. You stop expecting your kids to remember your birthday or your friends to ask how your week went. And for a while, less expectation does equal less hurt. The math checks out on paper, but here's what happens in the quiet years that follow. The part nobody warns you about. The fewer expectations you carry, the fewer reasons you have to stay. If you don't expect anyone to show up, you don't need them to show up. If you don't expect anyone to care, you don't need to stay in rooms with people. Withdrawal becomes isolation, becomes a life with the lights dimmed. The adaptation was meant to protect you, but protection and prison look very similar from the inside. The real trap isn't disappointment itself. It's treating disappointment about people in general the same way you'd treat disappointment about one person who hurt you. That conflation is what turns a sensible caution into a slow exit from connection. Small difference in thinking, enormous difference in where you end up. Self-abandonment finally recognized. You catch yourself in the mirror one morning and it lands different. The way your shoulders sit, how small your voice has gotten in your own life, not your body, the presence. Decades of reading other people's moods like a survival code, adjusting yourself to their weather until you forgot what your own felt like. Somewhere in your 20s and 30s, you learned that needing anything was weakness. So you became the one who listens, who apologizes first, who keeps the peace by keeping yourself entirely out of the equation. You got so practiced at swallowing what mattered that you stopped seeing yourself swallow. By 40 or 50, the arithmetic catches up fast. Every yes when your body screamed no. Every silence when you had something true to say, every time you made someone else's comfort more important than your own air. You kept that score without meaning to, and one day you realize it's not a debt. It's a theft. Cutting people off looks cruel from the outside, but from the inside it's survival. You're not being selfish when you finally stop drowning for an audience. You're recognizing that the first person you abandoned was the one you see every day. Some relationships couldn't stay because staying in them meant staying erased. By the time you're older, you're simply exhausted from the performance. You want the rest of your life to feel like home instead of a waiting room. The cutting off is the opposite of what it looks like. It's when you finally actually show up. People-pleasing burnout. You spent your 30s saying yes to every invite, every favor, every emotional conversation that came to your door. You remembered birthdays, you showed up, you laughed at jokes that weren't funny because the person telling them needed the laugh. And for years it worked. People loved you. You felt needed. That felt like belonging. Then something shifted. Around 40, maybe 45, you realized you were exhausted. Not tired from a long day, tired, depleted. The kind of tired where a text asking how you are feels like a demand, not a connection. You started canceling, not because you didn't care, but because caring had turned into a kind of slow drowning, and drowning people don't throw themselves back into the water. The cruelest part, the people you gave to for so long rarely noticed the change. They didn't see the years of adjustment. They didn't register the shift from full presence to strategic appearance. They just saw you withdrawing. And you couldn't explain it without sounding ungrateful or cold. so you didn't try. You just pulled back further. What nobody tells you is that resentment builds quietly underneath all that generosity. Every small sacrifice, every time you swallowed what you actually wanted, adds a brick to a wall. By 50, cutting people off isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. Your no is the only word left that means something. The silence around you isn't loneliness. It's finally listening to what you need instead of what everyone else expected you to give. And that, weirdly, feels like the first honest choice you've made in years. Silence becomes comfortable. Watch what happens in your 40s or 50s. A friend cancels plans and you do not scramble to reschedule. A group chat fills with noise and you mute it without guilt. A family gathering looms and you skip it. For the first time, none of this feels like betrayal. It feels like mercy. Silence used to be something you fixed. In your 20s, an empty evening meant loneliness. You filled it. In your 30s, quiet made you restless, and you reached for your phone, a plan, another person. But somewhere in the middle of your life, the energy required to show up socially starts to feel like debt you cannot afford. Silence stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like rest. You have spent decades learning what you actually like, not what you should like, not what performs well at dinner. And most people, most interactions, most obligations do not align with that truth anymore. So withdrawing is not cruelty or depression. It is conservation. You are protecting the finite hours you have left. The trap is that comfort can solidify. Silence restores you until it becomes a wall. A preference for solitude hardens into a story that no one understands you anyway. By the time you notice you have drifted too far, the cost of reaching back feels impossible. The difference matters. Comfortable quiet restores you. Lonely quiet hardens you. One is a boundary. The other is a cage. Stay alert to which one you are living in. Attention span erodes. You sit across from an old friend. They're telling you something, really telling you, the kind of story that needs patience to land. And halfway through, you realize you've stopped listening, not out of rudeness. Your mind just drifted. You couldn't hold the thread anymore, even though you wanted to. Here's what happens. As you get older, shallow attention starts to feel like a reflex you can't rewire. Your brain has been trained by years of notifications, headlines, and quick hits. The mental muscle for sitting still with another person's slow narrative begins to atrophy. A conversation that demands 20 minutes of unbroken focus feels like asking someone out of shape to run a marathon. The painful part isn't that you don't care. It's that maintaining real attention becomes genuinely exhausting. So instead of pushing through that fatigue with people you love, you start choosing solitude, places where you can think at your own pace, consume information in chunks, control the rhythm, no demands, no watching their face fall when you zone out. And then you stop initiating contact altogether, not because you're angry or cold, but because you know somewhere quiet inside that you can't give them what friendship requires anymore. You can't sit, you can't stay. So it feels easier to let the friendship fade than to feel like a ghost in their presence. The move here isn't about forcing yourself to listen longer. It's noticing when you've stopped. A walk with one person, no phone, no destination. Start stupidly small. Your attention didn't erode overnight. It won't rebuild overnight either, but it can. Meaning seeking accelerates. Around 40 or maybe 50, you start noticing it at dinner. Small talk that used to fill the evening now feels like time bleeding away. Someone's story about their job, their kids' schedule, their kitchen renovation, it doesn't catch you the way it once did. Not because you've gone cold. Your brain is simply doing something different. It's filtering harder for signal. This is meaning seeking, and it shifts into overdrive as you age. At 25, almost everything feels worth exploring. A new friend means new stories, new angles, new experiences unfolding. But after decades, patterns become visible. You start to recognize shapes. You've heard that story before, maybe not word for word, but the rhythm of it, the lesson underneath, the unspoken need driving it. What happens next is sharp. Your mind starts asking questions it didn't ask before. Does this connection actually nourish me? Does this person care about what matters, or are we just running a script together? That filter didn't exist at 25. Now it's always on. People feel this shift as rejection when it's actually you becoming less willing to autopilot. You cut people off not from cruelty, but from scarcity. You have maybe 30 or 40 good years left, maybe fewer. Your nervous system knows this, so it gets honest. It stops tolerating relationships that feel like obligations, conversations that feel hollow, people who only know the version of you that fits their story. The real catch, becoming selective is healthy, but it also means fewer people, and fewer people can feel a lot like loneliness, even when it's actually just you honoring what's real. Mortality quietly filters people. There is a moment in a person's life, sometimes fast, sometimes creeping, where the math shifts. Not pencil and paper math, but the kind your nervous system does without permission. You suddenly realize you have less time ahead than time behind. And that single shift rewires everything about who stays close and who fades. The people you once saw out of habit, obligation, or proximity become static. Not because they wronged you. Your brain has started running a new filter. Does this person make me feel alive, or do they remind me I am running out of time? One feels like nourishment. The other feels like a slow leak in hours you cannot replace. The cruelty is how invisible this becomes to those being filtered out. A friend notices slower texts. A sibling sees fewer visits. They assume it is personal, something they said, something they did, when really it is you facing your own clock. You are not rejecting them so much as becoming allergic to anything that tastes like wasted minutes. This is why people often grow closer to fewer people as they age, not from meanness, but from brutal honesty about what actually feeds them. The noise drops. Sometimes good people drop with it, victims of a ruthlessness never aimed at them, just collateral damage of knowing forever stopped being real. The world gets smaller, and loneliness fills the space where crowding used to be. And if you are on the other side of this, being slowly faded out by someone you care for, understand, it rarely means you failed. It means they heard their clock tick. Legacy focus intensifies. Somewhere around your 40th year, the question shifts beneath your feet. You stop asking whether today was fun and start asking whether it will echo when you're gone. That quiet reorientation doesn't announce itself. It just changes everything. Who stays in your circle, which fights end early, whose calls you answer, whose you let fade to silence. People spend decades hauling relationships like cargo, dragging them forward out of guilt or habit or old promises made to someone you no longer are. Then one morning, you realize you don't have to. That friend who always leaves you smaller, the relative who shows up only when they need something, the coworker you've smiled at for years, they stop fitting the shape of the life you want to leave behind. So you step back. It's not cruelty, it's triage. The math of aging gets very real, very fast. You count what's left, maybe 30 good years if luck holds, and suddenly an afternoon lost to someone else's crisis feels expensive in a way it never did at 25. You're not turning cold, you're turning clear, a relationship that drains more than it feeds, that doesn't align with who you actually are, starts to feel like a debt you never chose to take on. Some friendships were always meant to be chapters, not forever. They shaped you. They taught you something true. Then they ended. That's not rejection, that's completion. Older people aren't cutting everyone off. They're cutting away the people who don't belong in the story they're finishing. Wisdom-driven detachment. You know that moment when you realize a friend's drama has nothing to do with you and you suddenly feel lighter? That is not coldness. That is clarity arriving late. By your 50s or 60s, you have watched enough patterns repeat to see the machinery underneath. Your ex's neediness, your sibling's perpetual victim story, the colleague who triangulates everyone into conflict. You see it now, not with judgment, but with the exhaustion of someone who has watched the same play run 1,000 times. What gets misread as cruelty is actually a shift in your tolerance for carrying other people's unexamined lives. You stop believing that your presence alone can fix someone. You stop feeling responsible for their growth. That used to feel like abandonment to you when your parents modeled it. Now it feels like respecting boundaries, theirs and yours. The people who stay close are often the ones who do the work, too, who recognize their own patterns, who do not expect you to be their therapist or emotional waste bin. Everyone else starts to feel optional. Not in a bitter way, in a botanical way. You stop watering plants that were never yours to tend. So you cull, you let subscriptions to certain friendships expire, not because you became harder, but because you became selective about what you give your remaining energy to. That feels like detachment from the inside. From the outside, it looks like you disappeared. The real question is whether you left because you grew or whether you left because you gave up. Both feel identical in the moment. Ego fatigue in groups. You know that dinner party feeling. You laughed a shade too loud, asked questions just to keep the ball rolling, swallowed your real opinion about politics to keep the peace. You weren't being fake, exactly. You were managing how you land, what they think, whether this version of you passes the room, and it depletes something deep. In a group, your brain runs 2 channels at once. One watches what's happening, the other watches how you're being watched. Am I talking too much? Do they think I'm dull? Did that comment land? Or did I just commit it to memory as a social failure? Every conversation splits your attention. Every laugh gets vetted. Every opinion filters through the question, what will this cost me socially? You do this 10,000 times between 20 and 50. The bill comes due slowly. You don't wake up hating people. You wake up noticing that the energy spent managing yourself in groups no longer buys you much back. Small talk feels like work. A group chat feels like a second job. The arithmetic shifts. The exchange rate breaks. So you withdraw, not from depression necessarily, not from misanthropy, but from simple math. 1 honest hour alone now feels richer than 3 hours spent performing, one-on-one time or solitude, because at least there you can be tired without explaining it. You don't have to monitor. You don't have to land anything. Sometimes what looks like people pulling away isn't rejection of their friends at all. It's the moment authenticity finally became cheaper than the cost of wearing the mask. Narcissist patterns become obvious. You're at a dinner table and someone just told a story about their own triumph for the 3rd time. A friend mentions a health scare and the narcissist pivots to their own medical drama. You feel the subtle vacuum, not darkness, just the slow drain of being heard. At 25, you might have laughed it off. At 40, you see the pattern like a rip current you've been swimming against for years. The behavior itself never changed. Those people have always needed the spotlight, always steered conversations back to themselves, always made you feel small when you needed to matter. What shifts is your tolerance for it and your hard-won clarity about what it actually costs you. Every accomplishment gets minimized or compared. Every vulnerability you share gets weaponized later or dismissed. The quirks you once overlooked start to look like a cage. Here's what creeps up on you. Narcissists are genuinely charming. They perform connection beautifully, make you feel chosen in bursts, but only when they need something. The breadcrumbs feel like meals when you're hungry. As you get older, you stop being hungry the same way. You realize you deserve actual reciprocity, not just flashes of performance. You stop waiting for change. You stop rehearsing what you'll say to finally make them understand. Cutting people off at this point isn't cruelty or overreaction, it's recognition. You've spent enough years in that orbit to know it was never about you being too sensitive or too demanding. You simply reached the moment where staying felt more painful than leaving. That clarity, hard won as it is, becomes the permission you need. Manipulation, radar upgrades. You know that feeling when someone says something nice and your stomach goes tight? Years ago, you would have missed it entirely. Now you clock the timing, the flattery right before the ask, the sudden warmth after months of distance. Your nervous system has learned a language it didn't speak before. Younger, you trusted surface moves. A compliment was just a compliment. Spending money on you meant they cared. Reaching out after going silent meant they'd changed. But decades teach you that people have patterns, and patterns have purposes. The friend who only calls when they need something, the family member who softens you up before a boundary violation, the person who apologizes beautifully and then repeats the same wound. What looks like social withdrawal on the outside is actually a species upgrade on the inside. You are not becoming colder, you are becoming literate. You can read the subtext now, the passive aggression dressed as a joke, the guilt trip wrapped in concern, the control painted as love. And that clarity is exhausting because you can't unsee it. The brutal part, when you start declining invitations from people whose manipulations you've decoded, they often call you isolated or cold. They don't name what they did. They name what you stopped accepting. So you prune the list, not because you hate people, but because you no longer have the bandwidth to translate flattery while guarding your own wounds. Sometimes solitude is just what honesty looks like when you finally learned to hear it. Staying often costs more than leaving. Fake positivity aversion. You're at a dinner and someone says, "Everything happens for a reason." After you've just told them about your divorce, your stomach tightens, you say nothing, but inside, you're already planning which invitations to decline. There's a specific kind of rage that builds when people spray synthetic cheerfulness over real pain. It's not anger at optimism itself. It's anger at the refusal to meet you where you actually are. When you're grieving, tired, or genuinely struggling, the last thing you need is someone performing brightness like a defense against your feelings. As you get older, your tolerance for this shrinks to almost nothing. You've lived long enough to know that some seasons are hard. You've earned the right to say so without being met with motivational posters and toxic positivity platitudes. The people who do that, who insist on silver linings when you're describing actual loss, start to feel unsafe, so you stop calling them. Not out of bitterness, but out of protection. You know that person won't let you be human in front of them. They need you to be fine so they can feel fine. That's their work, not yours. The trap is this: you become someone who only shows up for deep, real conversations. You cut off the casual friendships, the light people, the ones who don't know how to sit with darkness. And maybe that's necessary, but sometimes you're cutting off connection because someone didn't know what you needed, not because they were actually hurting you. The line gets blurry, and after a while, you're alone with your realness, which starts to feel less like honesty and more like punishment. Emotional maturity gap. You're at dinner with someone you've known for years, and they're still processing hurt the way they did at 22, still punishing silences, still testing you to see if you'll stay, still treating every disagreement like a referendum on whether you actually care. Meanwhile, you've learned something quieter. That conflict doesn't mean the relationship is broken, that people mess up without being enemies, that sitting with discomfort is sometimes how love works. The gap between where you've arrived and where they're stuck becomes unbearable, not because you're better, but because you've paid the price to learn differently. Therapy, failed relationships, hard conversations with people who actually wanted to hear you. You've watched your own patterns, named them, felt the weight of what you didn't know. Now, when someone around you handles a problem the way you used to, it doesn't feel like a quirk. It feels like watching someone choose the same trap you spent years escaping. So you pull back, not from cruelty, but from exhaustion. You can't teach someone to be ready. You can't make them curious about their own mind. Staying close while they repeat the same hurt and withdraw cycle means absorbing their emotional weather as if it were the forecast for your own life. Sometimes the people who love you most get left behind, not because they're bad, but because they're stuck. Growing up meant learning to walk away from the version of love that costs you everything just to prove you're loyal. That's the isolation nobody warns you about. The loneliness that comes not from being rejected, but from outgrowing the people you thought would grow with you. Overcommitment collapse. Sarah wants coffee. Your cousin's birthday is next month. The volunteer shift, the work dinner, the text thread spinning with daily asks. Each one lands and you say yes. It feels small. It feels like being a good person. But months in, you are running on fumes. And suddenly, everyone feels like a debt you cannot pay. Your brain does something almost rational at that point. It decides the exhaustion is their fault. Sarah is always pulling you in. Your cousin expects too much. That coordinator is relentless. So you do not just slow down. You go quiet, you ghost, you cut ties, and you tell yourself it is protection, but really it is a system shutting down under its own weight. The cruel part is you picked these people. You genuinely wanted to show up for them, but somewhere between your own overwhelm and your resentment at being needed, the relationship flipped into something you resented. Instead of renegotiating earlier, instead of learning to say no before you burn out, you just vanished. That silence feels justified because it is partly true. You were too available. You did not guard your own time. But cutting everyone off does not solve the problem. It just teaches you nothing. Next cycle, you will say yes to too many things again because the real lesson never landed. How to notice the dread early before resentment takes root. The smaller, harder skill is catching yourself at the first twinge. Not when you are already furious, not when the goodbye text is half drafted. Earlier, that moment when their name lands and something in you tightens. That is when the real boundary gets set. Introversion blooms late. You spent your 20s thinking you were broken, too quiet at parties, too happy alone. People said you'd grow out of it, that you'd eventually want what everyone else seemed to want. The group chat, the packed calendar, the constant buzz of other people's company. So you tried. You showed up tired. You smiled through the noise. You kept believing the real version of you was still coming. Then something shifted, not overnight, but somewhere in your 30s or 40s, you stopped apologizing for silence. The exhaustion of performing sociability started to feel like actual poison. You realized that a Friday night alone with a book wasn't a failure. It was exactly what you needed. The people-pleasing machinery that had run for decades finally stuttered and died. Here's what nobody tells you. Introversion isn't something you're born with and keep the same way. It evolves, especially as you get older and you have less to prove. When you're young, introversion feels like a weakness you have to compensate for. You think you're broken because you don't want what the culture keeps telling you to want. But as the years add up, you start to trust your own nervous system. Small groups feel luxurious, solitude feels honest, and suddenly all those casual friendships that required constant upkeep start to feel like obligations dressed as relationships. The cutting off isn't cruelty, it's permission. You're finally old enough to build a life around what actually restores you, not what makes you look normal. That's not a reason to worry. That's maturity finally catching up to truth. Digital fatigue overflow. You wake up. Your phone is already asking for something, a message from someone you haven't seen in 6 years, an invite to someone's side hustle, a group chat that never sleeps. By 9 a.m., you have 70 small obligations floating in your head, none of them yours, all of them demanding something, a response, a like, a presence, a comment, an emoji. What happens is neurological, not moral. Your brain gets faster at saying no, not because you've become colder, but because attention has a maximum. Everyone past 40 knows this. You can hold maybe 5 close conversations and 40 casual ones before your nervous system starts calling friendly messages exhausting. It starts calling old friends' birthday posts another tax on bandwidth. The silence starts feeling like relief, and relief starts feeling like permission to just not text back, not scroll through their photos, not show up at the group thing. It is not cruelty, it is conservation. Your younger self ran the social equivalent of a 20 browser tab operation. Your current self knows those tabs are not open. They are all running in the background, eating your RAM. Many people who cut everyone off aren't actually cutting, they are collapsing. The connections don't fall because they stopped caring. They fall because your mind finally admitted what your body has been saying for years. Some versions of connection have gotten too expensive. Notice the difference between withdrawing because you need rest and withdrawing because you have decided you are done. One is honest, the other is just exhaustion wearing a philosophy. Notification overwhelm. Your phone buzzes. Text from a friend you haven't seen in months. Before you can read it, 3 Slack messages stack up, then an email, then a tagged photo, then a reminder about a Zoom call you forgot you agreed to. By the time you look at the friend's text, you are already tired. You text back something short. They feel the coldness. You feel the weight. What shifts at midlife is your tolerance for ambient noise, the constant social hum that once felt like proof you mattered. By 40, 50, 60, it feels like a debt you cannot pay. Every notification is a small obligation. Every message thread is a conversation that will keep asking for pieces of you for weeks. The math of it becomes impossible to ignore. The reflex becomes simple, easier to not open the group chat at all than to manage the guilt of half reading it. Easier to decline the invitation than to feel resentful about canceling later. Easier to let the person fade than to give them the half attention you have left. It feels like withdrawal, but it is really just honesty. This is not cruelty, it is triage. Your nervous system finally names what it can hold. Younger people have bigger buckets. Older people know theirs are finite. So they empty out the water closest to spilling over. You are not getting colder, you are getting quieter. And quiet people keep only the relationships that do not require constant translation through screens. Parasocial substitution. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through someone's updates at midnight and feel like you know them, like you're friends? That's not friendship. That's a mirage, and it's hollowing out the real kind for a lot of people. As you age, you accumulate followers, podcast hosts you know, YouTubers who tell you things no real person does. They hand you attention and vulnerability on demand. No miscommunication, no actual stakes. Real humans, they require negotiation. They disappoint. They need things back. Here's what happens. Parasocial relationships offer everything intimate connection promises with almost none of the friction. You feel understood by a creator who doesn't know you exist. You get the warm glow of attachment without the vulnerability. So gradually, almost invisibly, you stop taking risks with actual people. Why text a friend back when your favorite personality is always available, always performs, never falls silent in a way that feels rejecting? The trap is that these aren't relationships. They're more like psychological comfort food, and the older you get, especially if you've been burned or disappointed by flesh and blood people, the substitution becomes easier to justify. I have my community, you tell yourself. You do, just not one that can truly see you. The quiet cost is real isolation wearing the mask of connection. Before it calcifies, notice, are the people in your life optional to you in a way a screen never is? Are you waiting for real humans to perform at the level of content creators whose job is pleasing you? That gap is where the drift lives. Hormonal shifts rewire mood. You wake up one morning and the friend group text that used to light you up now feels like noise. The dinner invitations land wrong. Nothing about those people changed, but something about you did, and it happened without your permission. Around your 40s, 50s, and beyond, your body is turning the volume down on reward and up on threat. Testosterone drops. Estrogen swings or fades. Your nervous system becomes pickier about stimulation, slower to find joy in a crowded room. This is not weakness. This is your endocrine system doing what aging bodies do. Here is where the trap closes. You mistake the chemistry for truth. The party feels draining because those people are draining. The family call feels like dead weight because you do not care. But 5 years ago, that same wiring said the opposite. What rewired is not their value. It is the neurochemical lens you are looking through. Isolation feels earned now, reasonable. Your mood has become a narrator, whispering that smaller circles and silence are just what you need. And maybe they are wisdom. Or maybe your hormones are ghosting everyone on your behalf, and you are nodding along thinking it is choice. If withdrawal tightened around perimenopause, andropause, or thyroid drift, that timing matters. It is worth naming. A conversation with someone who understands hormonal neurobiology, not just life coaching, can shift this from I am becoming someone who pushes people away to my body is in a transition I can actually work with. That difference rewires everything. Testosterone decline effects. A man in his 50s stops wanting Friday drinks. Not burnout, not resentment, just nothing. The room that once felt electric now feels like static. He tells himself he's grown wiser, but his hormones wrote the script first. Testosterone, the fuel for social push and dominance play, begins its slow descent around 30. 1% a year, barely noticeable, until by 50 you wake up and the crowd sounds like noise instead of orchestra. Your brain runs on different chemistry now. Dopamine stops flooding in when you win an argument or make someone laugh at your joke. The old games, the performance, the proof, the need to be seen, they lose their voltage. Solitude shifts from feeling empty to feeling like sanctuary. You are not choosing withdrawal. Your nervous system is choosing a quieter channel. What makes this tricky is that the people around you cannot feel the shift in your body. They only see the shape of your absence. A declined invitation reads as rejection. A missed call becomes a pattern. The distance hardens into real estrangement, not because you wanted it, but because nobody named what was happening on either end. Not the chemistry, not the change in how your nervous system craves or rejects stimulation. If this lands, the move is not to muscle through the fade. It is to stay tethered while you still feel the pull toward the people who matter. Name it. Tell them your bandwidth changed, not your care. Small reach-outs now cost almost nothing and save almost everything later. Brain prunes connections too. Your brain is doing something right now that your calendar isn't. It's actively deleting, not memories, not personality, but pathways. The older you get, the more your brain decides certain neural routes are not worth keeping alive. Synapses that don't fire regularly get stripped away. This is not failure or decline. It is efficiency. And here is where friendship collides with neurology. Maintaining a connection takes neural real estate. Every text you owe, every birthday you remember, every inside joke you retrieve, that costs something in your wiring. When you were 25, your brain had capacity to run dozens of weak friendships on idle. You could half show up and still feel tethered. Somewhere in your 30s or 40s, your brain starts asking harder questions. Which relationships actually light up your reward circuits? Which ones leave you drained? The pruning is not conscious. You simply notice one day that you don't think about certain people anymore. The effort to reach out feels heavier. Here is the quieter truth. The friendships that survive the cut become denser. Your brain is not just cutting people off. It is investing deeper in the ones that actually matter. The person you still text at 2 a.m., the one you would call in crisis, those connections grew roots while others faded. So the coldness you feel might not be moral laziness. Your neurology might be doing the sorting your conscious mind was too kind to do. The real question is whether you are letting it prune toward the people who actually light you up or just toward whatever feels easiest. Cognitive load management. Your brain has a fuel tank, not metaphorical. Actual metabolic resources that deplete when you process information, make decisions, navigate social dynamics, remember names, track gossip, decode tone in a text. At 30, you probably didn't notice the tank emptying. At 50, it's all you notice. You spend your 20s and 30s accumulating relationships like you're building a museum. Each friendship is another exhibit that requires maintenance. A birthday text, a check-in call, a careful memory of their kid's name and their new job. It all costs something, even when it feels natural. But your brain has a carrying capacity, and it's not infinite. As you age, something shifts. You stop seeing those relationships as treasures and start seeing them as obligations. The person who calls every month now feels like a cognitive debt. The group chat becomes a drain, and the simplest edit is to delete the contact, mute the thread, let the distance grow until the friendship becomes optional. What looks cold from the outside is often just triage. You are not becoming cruel. You are becoming realistic about your own bandwidth. The relationships that remain are the ones that generate more energy than they consume, or at least require the least translation, no one to impress, no subtext to decode. The cutting off is not about malice, it is about honesty. Your energy is finite, and every yes to someone is a no to yourself. As you age, that math gets harder to ignore, and the pruning becomes survival instead of cruelty. Decision fatigue reduction. By the time you hit 40 or 50, you've already said yes to roughly 1 million social obligations. Lunches with people you tolerate, group chats that buzz all day, weddings of friends, texts that require an actual response. Your brain has been running a spreadsheet of social calculations for decades, and it's exhausted. Decision fatigue is real, and it stacks hard. Every interaction requires a tiny choice: what mood to be in, whether to be honest or polite, how much energy to give. Multiply that by dozens of people, and you're not just tired, you're running on fumes. So somewhere around midlife, something shifts. You stop calculating whether you should show up. You simply don't. This isn't coldness, it's math. Your brain learned that every relationship demands a decision tax, and after thousands of daily micro choices, what to wear, what to eat, what to say at work, the social calendar becomes the place where you finally say no. Not because you hate people, because you're protecting the few decisions that actually matter: your peace, your time, your authentic self. The people who stay close in your later years are often the ones who don't require you to perform that calculation at all. No obligation feel, no emotional negotiation, just presence. And the strange thing is, once you've cut the fatigue out of your life, you often find you have more energy for the people who remain. Quality over the exhaustion of quantity. If you're watching someone pull back, they're not becoming colder. They're becoming smarter about where their remaining attention goes. Trauma reenactment avoidance. There's a friend from your 20s who laughed too much at your pain, or a family dinner that went silent in a way that still lives in your chest. Years later, you notice yourself crossing the street when you see them. Not anger, just a quiet, automatic no. Your nervous system saw a pattern and closed the door before your mind could explain why. This is what reenactment avoidance looks like. Not because you're holding a grudge, but because your body learned something from before, a certain kind of voice, a familiar silence, the way someone's eyes move when they're about to say something cruel. These become invisible tripwires. Being around that person or people like them feels like standing at the edge of a cliff you've already fallen off. The isolation that comes next isn't spite. It's self-preservation dressed as distance. As you age, you have fewer second chances to burn and less time to recover from being hurt in the same way twice. The margin for error shrinks. So if someone triggered something deep, the calculus becomes brutal. The risk of reliving that doesn't equal the benefit of their company. Not anymore. What makes it stick is that you rarely know you're doing it. You just feel tired around them, heavy, or suddenly unavailable. You don't think, I'm avoiding a trauma pattern. You think, I don't have the energy. Both can be true, but by your 40s and 50s, those quiet avoidances have stacked into walls. People on the outside see coldness. You're just trying not to drown in yesterday. Family obligations get questioned. There's a moment most people don't see coming, usually somewhere in your 30s or 40s, when you realize you've been showing up to something out of pure inertia. Not love, not even habit exactly, just the echo of someone else's rules living inside your head. For many, that something is family. When you're young, the script is handed to you whole. You call on birthdays, you come home for holidays, you sit through dinners with people whose company bores or exhausts you because they share your blood. The obligation feels as natural as breathing. It's just what you do. But time does something strange. It gives you permission to ask why. And when you ask why, things crack. You start noticing patterns. The relative who only calls when they need something. The sibling who made you feel small for decades. The family gathering where you always play the same role, defend the same position, swallow the same resentment. You realize you're not actually obligated at all. You're just afraid of guilt, of being called selfish, of the silence that comes after you stop showing up. Some people cut ties entirely. Others rebuild on different terms, less frequency, clearer boundaries, genuine choice instead of compulsion. Either way, something shifts. You stop treating family like a mortgage and start asking, do these people actually add something to my life? Or am I just paying a debt that was never really mine to begin with? That question, once asked, rarely goes quiet again. The hard part isn't leaving, it's admitting you wanted to leave all along. Toxic positivity rejection. You sit with a real problem. A loss, a fear, something that weighs on the chest. A friend leans in with good intentions and says, everything happens for a reason, or at least you have your health. The words land wrong. Not because they are wrong exactly, because they skip over you. They skip the grief entirely, as if sadness is just a puzzle to be solved instead of a place you need to be for a while. As you get older, you develop what you might call a low tolerance for emotional bypassing. You have seen enough hardship to know that some things are not fixable with reframing. Sometimes things are just hard. Sometimes people hurt. And pretending otherwise does not actually help anyone. It just teaches people to hide what they really feel, to perform okayness when they are not. Younger people, well-meaning people, often reach for positivity like a fire extinguisher. They cannot sit with your sadness without trying to solve it. When you pull away from that, they feel rejected. You feel exhausted. Both of you walk away thinking the other one is the problem. After decades of hearing empty reassurance, you stop reaching out to people who cannot simply say, "That sounds really hard," and sit with you there. You cut them off not out of cruelty, but because you have learned that some presences make loneliness feel worse than silence. The quiet of someone who gets it becomes far more valuable than the noise of someone who is trying to fix it. So your circle shrinks, not because you are bitter, but because you are honest about what actually helps. You keep the people who can meet you in reality, and you let the rest go. Comfort trap finally breaks. You know that feeling when you've worn the same sweater for 3 winters straight? It's soft in the exact places your body expects it. There's a smell in it. Nobody else would want it. At some point, you stop asking whether you like it and start asking whether you can imagine getting dressed without it. That's what happens with people too, especially as you get older. You stay in the same circle because the friction has worn smooth. You don't have to explain your childhood to them. They know which jokes land. You can sit in silence without it meaning anything. The relationships aren't necessarily good, they're just familiar. And familiar feels like safety when everything else in life is shifting. Your body's changing, work's uncertain, the world's confusing. So you grip tighter to what doesn't require translation. Then one day, usually without drama, the grip loosens. Maybe someone says something that would have been fine last year, but lands wrong now. Maybe you realize you're tired of code switching, tired of laughing at things that aren't funny anymore. The sweater suddenly feels itchy, and for the first time in years, you notice there's a whole closet you've never opened. That moment when comfort stops feeling like ease and starts feeling like a cage, that's when people start pruning, not from anger, not from cruelty, just from finally admitting that staying comfortable was never the same as staying alive. The people you cut off weren't the problem, the trap was, and the trap only breaks when the price of staying becomes higher than the fear of change. Anticipated abandonment defense. A text response slows down, a plan gets canceled, and something shifts inside you. Not rage, just a cold readiness to leave before being left. You start thinking how you'd be fine without them anyway, how you never really needed this friendship. That preemptive hardening, that strike against your own heart before it can be broken, is anticipatory abandonment defense. Your nervous system learned this early. Closeness has an expiration date. Maybe you were hurt, maybe you watched someone you loved get hurt. So your brain builds a strategy. If you leave first, if you distance yourself before they can, then you control the pain. You're not abandoned, you chose to go. It feels like armor, but there's a cost most people don't see until later. Every time you pull back this way, you're training yourself to read ambiguity as rejection. A friend gets busy, abandonment. Someone needs space, proof they never cared. Your mind becomes a prosecutor, gathering evidence of betrayal it already expects to find. The real danger is how smoothly it works. You push people away with such quiet justification that nobody even realizes what happened. By 50 or 60, you've built a structure meant to keep pain out, but you're also locked inside it, having proven to yourself again and again that people can't be trusted. The escape isn't force, it's catching the moment the defense activates. That cold feeling, that story about not needing them. Notice it. 1 second of awareness before the distance hardens into habit can stop years of unnecessary solitude. Preemptive rejection strategy. Your mind moves faster than the phone. Someone might call, someone might not. Either way, you've already decided no. It feels cleaner to disappear first, to be the one who steps back before the sting lands. This is the arithmetic of preemptive rejection, and it hums quietly beneath a lot of older age loneliness. Decades of living collect data like scars, a friendship that faded without explanation, a family group chat where nobody asks how you're doing, that gathering where you showed up and felt like a ghost. Each memory builds a story. People will abandon you if given the chance. So you flip the script. You become the one who leaves first. You don't text. You assume they're too busy. You decline before the invitation even forms. Here's the trap. It feels like wisdom, like boundaries, like protection, but it's actually a prophecy you're writing yourself, one small rejection at a time. When you withdraw first, you never learn if someone would have actually shown up. You never find out if an old friend still thinks about you. You never give anyone the chance to surprise you. What makes this especially vicious in older years is how it compounds. Fewer people reach out because fewer people are still trying. Your world shrinks not because others left, but because you left before they could. Next time you feel that impulse to decline before being asked, just pause and notice it. That small moment of awareness is where the pattern breaks. Emotional self-sufficiency. You hit it sometime in your 40s, that quiet morning when a bad day happens and you don't reach for your phone. You felt lonely, so you sat with it instead. You needed to decompress, so you walked. Somewhere between the habit and the pattern, you realize something. You stopped needing anyone to feel okay, not pridefully, just mechanically, like you'd finally cracked the code. The thing about emotional independence is that it works. You learn to soothe yourself. You build real resilience. You stop relying on others to manage your own interior weather. But here's where the trap closes. Your brain starts filing people under optional, not from cruelty, from genuine completion. Why call when you can handle it? Why risk vulnerability when you've got a solid routine that never disappoints? What unfolds is almost invisible. The friend who used to hear your fears gets fewer calls. The family member you once leaned on becomes someone you see less. You're not withdrawing maliciously, you're just sufficient now, self-contained. And that self-containment starts to feel like a reason not to bother. Pure efficiency. But connection was never about need. It was about the specific ache of being known, of mattering to someone despite your competence. Emotional self-sufficiency teaches you to reframe that ache as weakness, as a sign you haven't completed yourself yet. So you cut people off not from anger, but from a kind of quiet arithmetic. You've learned to live alone so well that having others feels like an unnecessary complication. And by then, the silence you built feels too solid to break. Attachment to routine. 6:47 a.m., same chair, same coffee, same light coming through the same window. A friend texts about lunch at a place you've never been, a time that doesn't align with your usual rhythm, and something in you tenses, not because of the restaurant, but because the suggestion threatens the invisible rails your life runs on. Those rails feel so smooth compared to the jagged unpredictability of almost everything else. Routine becomes less a convenience and more a skeleton key as you get older. Your habits are where control actually lives, while the wider world spun into chaos and surprise somewhere between 30 and 50, your schedule stayed loyal. Your patterns stayed knowable, so when someone asks you to step outside that frame, new faces, new times, new adjustments to make, it reads like a small threat to the structure that's keeping you steady. But here's what happens on their side of the equation. People feel the resistance. They notice you're more present when things are scheduled than when they're spontaneous. They sense that they fit into your life only if they slot into the existing groove, and that's a lonely feeling, being an obligation squeezed into someone else's grid. So they ask less, then they ask not at all. The warmth you feel in your routine is real, but from the outside, it looks like a door that's closed, and the narrower that door becomes, the fewer people can fit through it with you. What once protected you starts quietly to separate you. Loneliness reframed as freedom. There's a moment, usually around a quiet Tuesday evening, when you realize you haven't checked your phone all day. No texts waiting, no obligations calling. And instead of the old sting, that feeling of being left behind, something else arrives, relief, maybe even something like peace. You've stopped calling it loneliness and started calling it something else entirely. This shift is not accidental. As people withdraw from their networks, they begin rewriting the narrative around isolation. Solitude becomes a choice. Quietness becomes a luxury. The absence of people stops feeling like rejection and starts feeling like reclamation. Your time, your space, your rules uninterrupted. It works so well that cutting ties can start to feel noble, even necessary. The trap is subtle and seductive. Real solitude can be restorative. But when it's built on the ash of severed relationships, it's still loneliness, just one with better PR. You're not free from people, you're hiding from the discomfort of maintaining connection. The quiet isn't liberation, it's a consequence you've learned to call one. Telling the difference requires honesty. Does the quiet feel chosen, or does it feel like the only option left after you've pushed everyone away? Can you walk back into a room full of people without feeling like a stranger? Or have you trained yourself so well in isolation that connection now feels impossible. Freedom without the capacity for connection isn't freedom at all. It's just a smaller world you've convinced yourself you wanted. Reputation maintenance fatigue. By your 40s or 50s, you've already performed 1,000 times. You know the role, the version of yourself that lands well with that friend, that colleague, that family member who brings out a certain version. You've managed which thoughts stay private. You've edited yourself in group chats, at dinners, at work events. The tax of that performance accumulates in ways younger people rarely understand yet. Then one morning, something shifts. Not sadness, not anger, just the weight of it. The math changes. The energy cost of keeping up the relationship, the filtering, the strategic vulnerability, the careful laughs starts to outweigh what you actually receive in return. So you stop calling, you don't make plans, and slowly people fade away. What looks like coldness from the outside is often just resource allocation. You have limited fuel, and it starts to feel wasteful to burn it on people who only know the curated version anyway. There's a particular sting in that closeness, being near someone and still feeling alone because you can't fully show up. The quiet truth is that this happens most intensely with people who've never earned permission to see you. You're not cutting off close friends. You're abandoning the shallow people-pleasing relationships that always required a mask. There's relief in that, even if it looks like isolation. What you might actually need is not fewer people, but braver ones. People you can be tired in front of, without performing strength. Fear of being seen fully. By your 40s or 50s, you've assembled a polished version, the one that shows up in texts, at dinners, in family photos. Underneath it lives someone nobody really knows, not your spouse, not the friend you've had for 30 years, not even you anymore because you stopped looking down there. The gap widens every year until the thought of actual visibility feels less like intimacy and more like a threat to your survival. So you shrink the circle, fewer calls, shorter visits, you cancel more often. It's not that affection drained away, it's that the stakes feel unbearable. What if they notice the anger you've been carrying? What if they sense you're exhausted from performing? What if they glimpse shame or desire or doubt that doesn't match the person they've decided you are? Your nervous system learned long ago that being fully seen means being fully condemned, so now it keeps doors locked and people at the edge of the threshold. The mind sells this withdrawal as protection. You're being discerning, guarding your peace, but what's actually happening is you're becoming less real, even to yourself, an edit, a curated thing, a ghost of possibility. The longer you keep people out, the less air reaches that hidden, wanting part of you. The antidote isn't to overshare with everyone. It's to find one person safe enough that you can stop performing, because a self without witnesses eventually stops mattering, even to you. Shame concealment retreat. 5 years back, you made a choice, not a slip, not an accident, a choice, and you have not told a soul, not your closest friend, not your partner. Twice a month it surfaces, that small knot in your chest. The longer the secret sits, the more confessing feels impossible. So you do not confess. You text less. You decline the coffee invitation. You let the friendship fade just enough that nobody gets to ask the questions that matter. Shame operates like a reverse gravity well. It pulls you inward while pushing everyone away, because closeness means exposure, and if someone gets too close, they might see not just what you did, but what you believe it says about who you are. As you age, the catalog grows. Failed marriages, professional humiliations, money mistakes, words spoken that cannot be unspoken, small unkindnesses you replay in the dark, so you cut first. You call it outgrowing, or being too busy, or having different values now. Frame it as evolution instead of what it actually is, a preemptive strike. You disappear before they figure out who you have become, before they decide you are not worth staying connected to. Here is the trap. Shame thrives in isolation. The longer you hide, the more the fiction grows. You stop testing whether anyone would actually reject you and instead just assume they will. You forget that most people are walking around with their own small knots, their own unsaid things, and they might understand far better than you think. But by then, you are already gone. Perfectionist isolation. You finally schedule that coffee with an old friend. An hour before, you realize your apartment isn't clean enough, your hair isn't right, you haven't worked out in weeks, so you cancel. The excuse is easy. Work got busy, you're tired. The real reason is quieter. You're not ready to be seen like this. Perfectionists don't usually isolate because they hate people. They isolate because they hate the gap between who they think they should be and who they actually are. Every text feels like a performance you're not prepared for. Every dinner feels like proof you've let yourself slip. So instead of showing up imperfectly, you disappear. The cruel part is that the more you withdraw, the worse that gap gets. You're not at the gym, not maintaining friendships, not in motion toward the version of yourself you think is acceptable. Your life shrinks, and a smaller life makes it easier to convince yourself that isolation is actually just being selective. You're waiting for the right time to reconnect, when you're really waiting for a version of yourself that will never arrive. What makes this different from ordinary shyness is the silence afterward. A shy person might feel anxious about a hangout. A perfectionist feels ashamed, and shame is sticky. It compounds. You miss one gathering, so you're out of the loop, so the next invitation feels impossible. The move here isn't to lower your standards or stop caring about growth. It's to notice when your standards have become a reason to disappear instead of a reason to show up. Your people don't need your best self. They need the real one. Trust threshold rises. At 25, you might tell a stranger your deepest worry at a bar. At 45, you guard the same wound from people you have known for a decade. Your trust threshold, the invisible bar that someone has to clear before you let them in, doesn't just go up. It shoots up like rent in a hot market. Every disappointment, every betrayed confidence, every shallow person gets filed away by your nervous system, not as a grudge against that one person, but as evidence that the world is more slippery than you thought. So the next person has to work harder. They have to show up more times. They have to prove they are not just kind once. They have to be consistent across months, across conflict, across boredom. You might not even notice it happening. You do not wake up thinking, I will now require triple the proof of loyalty. Instead, you just feel a quieter reluctance, an extra hesitation before you share something real, a faster drift when a friendship starts feeling one-sided. What keeps it locked in place is exhaustion. By your 40s and 50s, you have learned something true. Shallow friendships are work. They ask for your energy, but give nothing back. So somewhere in your body, you made a quiet choice. Fewer people, but ones worth the vulnerability. The high threshold is not cruelty. It is self-protection that learned to call itself honesty. The gamble is that some genuinely trustworthy people never get the chance to prove it. You have already walked past them, waiting in the lobby. Interpersonal ROI thinking. A friend cancels twice and your mind moves fast. Tally up what you have poured in, measure what came back, and the math feels grim. There is an almost clean feeling to it, like you are finally being rational instead of sentimental. What you are actually doing is converting a person into a ledger. Your brain, tired and seasoned now, starts applying business logic to human bonds. If the return does not justify the spend, the whole thing feels like waste. You stop reaching out. You let it fade. You wait for them to prove the relationship is worth the effort. And when they don't, because they are also tired, also struggling, you close the door. Some of the people most worth keeping will have seasons where they cannot match your output. A parent swallowed by grief, a sibling drowning quietly, someone dealing with depression who goes silent for months. When you are running pure ROI numbers, you do not see a struggling human. You see a failed asset. But isolation does not come from scarcity. It comes from this. The more you filter people through transactional thinking, the fewer will keep trying. You end up surrounded only by other accountants, all keeping score, all ready to leave when the numbers falter. You built the lonely life you were trying to avoid. The move is not staying in dead relationships. It is catching yourself in the math and pausing. Am I exhausted or am I actually finished? Those are two completely different truths. Exhausted people need permission to slow down, not a pink slip. Emotional bandwidth shrinks. By 40 or 50, you have collected them without meaning to. A sibling who drinks too much, a friend who needs constant reassurance, a colleague extracting your patience, aging parents, a partner, kids, maybe an ex who still texts. Each one pulses in the background, pulling from the same well. Presence, energy, attention. The bank account never restocked itself, but the withdrawals kept coming. What people don't talk about is the shift that happens quietly inside. Your capacity to absorb all of it does not remain constant through the decades. It shrinks, not because you turned cold or mean, but because you spent the currency without knowing it was finite. The emotional reserve at 30 is not the same reserve at 50. One day you read a message from someone and instead of warmth or curiosity, you feel weight, simple, heavy weight. So the cutting starts. No drama, no conversation, just the slow fade. The text sits unanswered. The dinner gets skipped. Initiating stops. From outside, it looks like you abandoned them. From inside, it feels like survival, like the only way to keep the whole system from shutting down completely. The hard part is that this looks identical to cruelty if you don't understand the physics of it. But the decision isn't really about love changing. It is about watching what little energy remains and making the brutal choice about where it can actually land. The people who stay close, the ones who don't resent you, they're usually the ones who figured this out about their own lives too. Sensory processing sensitivity. A crowded restaurant that felt fine at 25 becomes almost unbearable at 45. The noise hasn't changed. The lights haven't changed. But your nervous system is processing it all more acutely now, catching subtleties, getting worn down by them. Researchers call this sensory processing sensitivity, and it's not a mood problem. It's wired into your neurology. About 20% of people start this way from birth, but the trait often sharpens as you age. Your brain becomes hyper-attuned to the small things, the strain in someone's voice, a flickering bulb, a smell lingering from another room. You notice what others glide past. It sounds like a superpower until it becomes a tax on your energy, and that's when you start pulling back. Socializing demands more filtering, more recovery time afterward. Group dinners feel less fun and more exhausting. A casual night out leaves you depleted for days. So you see fewer people in quieter spaces, alone more often, the path of least resistance. People without this wiring often misread it as coldness or snobbery. They don't feel the weight of a friend's stressed tone, the emotional shift when conversation darkens, the invisible judgment in a crowded room. They assume you're rejecting them. Sometimes you are, but mostly you're protecting your own nervous system from overload. The answer isn't to force yourself back into the noise. It's to redesign your social life around what actually sustains you now. Smaller groups, quieter places, deeper one-on-ones instead of surface-level crowd time. Your need for fewer, more intentional connections isn't selfishness. It's precision about how you're built. Grievance record keeping. You know that person who can tell you, word for word, what you said to them 5 years ago? The hurt, the exact phrase, the way it landed. They've kept a mental ledger so detailed it has dates and footnotes. That ledger becomes a prison for both of you. Here's what happens. As we age, our brains get better at pattern matching and worse at forgetting. A sibling who forgot your birthday once becomes someone who always forgets. A friend's casual comment becomes proof they never cared. Each new slight gets filed away, cross-referenced with old ones until you have a case file thick enough to close the relationship on. The trap is that grievance record keeping feels like wisdom, like you're protecting yourself. You spot the pattern early, you say, you see who they really are, but what you're actually doing is building a case against connection itself. You're collecting evidence that people are disappointing, and then you wonder why isolation feels safer than trust. The people who cut everyone off don't usually do it explosively. They do it quietly, after the ledger gets too heavy. One more thing added to the file. One more reason added to the pile, and one day they wake up and realize they've documented their way into complete solitude. The shift, if you want it, start forgetting on purpose, not the big betrayals, but the small ones, the minor slights, the forgotten details. Let some of it go. A relationship with an open ledger can breathe. A mind without a grievance file has room for actual people again. Forgiveness capacity depletes. Think about the first time someone truly hurt you. You probably replayed it 100 times, turned it over in your mind, maybe even found reasons to let it go. There was still oxygen in the tank. Forgiveness was uncomfortable, but it was available to you. Now think about the 37th time someone disappointed you, or the 5th person who made the same kind of broken promise. Something shifts, not all at once, quietly over years. What happens is your forgiveness budget gets spent. It's not that you become meaner or colder. It's that you run out of the internal resources that forgiveness requires: patience, curiosity about another person's struggles, the ability to absorb hurt without making it mean something about your worth. Those things are finite. You can spend them lavishly in your 20s, expecting endless refills. By 50, you start noticing the bottom of the jar. The cruel part is that people who've hurt you the most, family, old friends, partners, they often get the coldest treatment, not because you hate them more, but because they depleted the reservoir first and deepest. You have nothing left to spend on their apology, their explanation, their second chance. So instead of a painful conversation, they get silence. Instead of a door left ajar, they get a door that closes. The instinct here isn't to keep chasing forgiveness like it's a moral virtue you're failing at. It's to get intentional about who you spend that capacity on. Some relationships deserve your forgiveness reserves, others don't. And the quiet truth? That's not bitterness. That's wisdom about where your generosity actually fits. Existential loneliness accepted. There is a moment late in life when someone stops fighting the fact that they will die alone, not in the literal sense, but in the sense that nobody, truly nobody, can live your inner life for you. That recognition, when it lands, changes everything about how you choose to spend your remaining energy. Most of us spend our 30s and 40s running from that knowledge. We build relationships partly because we love, sure, but also because we are bargaining. If I gather enough people around me, the logic goes, I won't feel the weight of my own consciousness. We phone friends we do not need. We attend parties where we feel invisible. We stay in dynamics that drain us because stopping feels like admitting the loneliness was real all along. By 70 or 80, some people stop that bargain. They look at their phone, their calendar, their obligations, and they think, why? The social machinery keeps grinding, calls you do not want to take, dinners where you perform yourself, the exhausting work of being palatable. And for what? To delay knowing something that is true whether you know it or not. What looks like withdrawal from the outside is sometimes clarity from within. A person cuts people off not because they grew colder, but because they became honest about what genuine connection actually takes and what it does not. The loneliness does not go away, but the pretense does, and that, strange as it sounds, can feel like freedom. The trap, though, is confusing acceptance with surrender. Solitude is a choice made in presence. Isolation is a choice made in fear. One is freedom. The other is just another name for the bargain. Selective memory bias. You run into someone you haven't seen in years. They light up. Remember that amazing road trip? They say. You nod and smile, but inside you're thinking, car breaking down, the money we fought over, how uncomfortable the motel was. They're not lying. Neither are you. You're both remembering the same trip through completely different filters. As you age, your brain doesn't store what actually happened. It stores what felt important or what fit a story you were already telling yourself. The betrayal sticks. The quiet kindness fades. That one conversation where someone disappointed you replays in HD every time you consider reaching out. The 5 years of small support before that? Grainy. This is why cutting people off feels so justified. You've got a highlight reel of disappointment running on loop, and it feels like evidence. You're not being harsh, you're being realistic. Except your realistic is a filtered version. Your brain has already decided the relationship wasn't worth much, and now every memory gets edited to prove that conclusion. A person who showed up for you gets filed under not reliable because one time they couldn't. A friend who tried gets remembered for the trying itself, not the fumbling kindness underneath it. By the time you're older, decades of relationships have been compressed into short clips of regret. The move isn't to force yourself to stay connected to everyone. It's to notice when you're using your memory like a prosecutor instead of a witness. Before you disappear, ask yourself, am I remembering this accurately, or am I remembering what I've decided to believe? Illusory intimacy exposed. You know that person you've texted for 3 years. You tell them things. They respond quickly. The conversation feels easy, warm, real. Then one day, you're in actual trouble, really need something, and the reply comes 6 days later. Or doesn't come at all. That gap between the friendship you thought you had and the one that actually exists, that's the moment the mirage cracks. Text and social media collapse distance in a way that feels dangerously like closeness. A double tap reads as affection. A quick reply reads as prioritization. You can pour your evening into a voice note, feel heard, feel seen, and walk away convinced you've connected. But connection doesn't become real just because the messaging app is open. The other person might be half watching a show. They might be extending kindness, not offering their actual self. The older you get, the less patience you have for this particular trap. You've spent decades learning to spot the difference between someone who shows up and someone who performs interest for an audience. You've learned that real intimacy means someone keeps showing up when it costs something, when there's no one watching, when you've asked the hard thing a second time, when your need doesn't fit their schedule. So you start cutting off the people who glow in group chats but vanish when you're alone. The ones who know your secrets but not your actual life. The ones who trade warmth for distance the moment the stakes rise. It's not cruelty, it's the quiet recognition that some friendships are written in disappearing ink. Social media comparison exit. Scroll far enough and you'll find someone's vacation, someone's promotion, someone's wedding announcement, all within 5 minutes. By your 40s, you've learned to see the machinery. The algorithm doesn't care about truth, only what keeps you clicking, comparing, feeling just small enough to scroll again. A promotion without the hours worked. A house without the mortgage anxiety. A marriage without the fights. Your brain compresses everyone's best moments into one screen and decides everyone is winning except you. That quiet sting compounds over time. You start measuring your own life against phantom versions of people you barely talk to. It's not bitterness that pushes older people away from social media. It's exhaustion. They didn't stop caring about friends. They stopped tolerating the comparison machine. They realized they didn't need to know their college roommate's kid got into Yale or that their neighbor is training for a triathlon. The exit often happens without ceremony. You unfollow. You stop refreshing. You let friendships narrow to people you see in actual rooms where they exist as they are, not as their edited selves. It feels like loss until you notice something shift. Your baseline for contentment rises again. You stop measuring. You stop scrolling. You remember what it felt like to be okay with your own life, without everyone else's highlights held up as a mirror. If you're feeling that pull away, trust it. It might not mean you don't like people. It might mean you're finally protecting yourself from the wrong mirror.